This is 2 hours of the darkest Family Guy episodes, so sit back, grab a snack, and let's get started with our first episode. So there's this Family Guy episode called Screams of Silence, the story of Brenda Q, and honestly, it's probably the most messed up thing the show ever did. We're talking about serious domestic violence here. This episode shows Quagmire's sister Brenda getting beaten by her boyfriend Jeff, and it gets really dark really fast. Everything starts when Quagmire almost kills himself in a weird accident and ends up in the hospital. His sister Brenda shows up with her boyfriend Jeff, and you can tell something's wrong immediately. Jeff is a complete psycho who treats Brenda like garbage right in front of everyone. He won't even let her hug her own brother without getting angry. The guy screams at her for literally nothing and acts like he owns her. What makes this so disturbing is how real it feels. Jeff beats her constantly. The neighbors hear him yelling at her through the walls every night. He controls everything she does, who she talks to, where she works, even what clothes she can wear. When Lois tries to take Brenda out for lunch, you see how messed up Brenda's become. She can't even close a menu at a restaurant without panicking that she's doing something wrong. The abuse just keeps getting worse throughout the episode. Jeff punches Brenda so hard she has to wear sunglasses to hide her black eyes. He breaks her finger and then jokes about it, saying it fell down the stairs. But the mental abuse is just as bad. He tells her she's worthless, makes her work over 100 hours a week, and cuts her off from any friends or family. Brenda's so brainwashed she actually defends him, saying he's sweet, and hits her softly when they're alone. It's sick. The show doesn't hold back on showing Jeff's manipulation tactics either. He isolates Brenda from everyone who might help her, making her completely dependent on him. He destroys her self-esteem by constantly telling her she's fat, ugly, and stupid. When she tries to defend herself or explain his behavior to others, she sounds completely delusional, because that's what abuse does to people. It warps their reality. There's this really disturbing scene where Jeff demands Brenda take off her nightgown so he can draw her while he screams at her about money. It's clearly sexual abuse on top of everything else, but the show handles it in a way that makes you understand what's happening without being exploitative about it. The whole episode feels like watching a real domestic violence situation unfold, which is what makes it so uncomfortable. Things get really bad when the family tries an intervention. Quagmire gets everyone together to tell Brenda she needs to leave Jeff. The intervention scene is heartbreaking because Quagmire basically begs his sister to come back to him. He says the sister he grew up with doesn't exist anymore and she's just become a punching bag. He reads this emotional letter about how much he loves her and wants her back. But instead of leaving Jeff, Brenda drops a bombshell. She's marrying him because she's pregnant. Now there's going to be a baby stuck in this nightmare too. The pregnancy announcement is where the episode gets even darker. Jeff makes it clear he doesn't want the baby and is only marrying Brenda because he knocked her up. He suggests naming the baby Slappy or Bruisey, which shows he's already planning to abuse the kid. This adds another layer of horror because now an innocent child is going to grow up in this violent household. That's when Quagmire, Peter, and Joe lose it. They're so sick of watching Brenda get beaten that they decide to murder Jeff. They trick him into going on a fake hunting trip planning to kill him in the woods, but Jeff figures out what's happening and flips the script on them. He takes Quagmire hostage and is about to shoot him. The whole murder plot shows how domestic violence affects everyone around the victim. These guys are normally law-abiding citizens, but they're driven to commit murder because they feel helpless watching someone they care about get destroyed. Joe's a cop and even he's willing to break the law because he knows the system won't protect Brenda. Here's where it gets crazy. Jeff's about to execute Quagmire when Quagmire dares him to put the gun down and fight like a man. Jeff thinks he can easily beat up skinny Quagmire, so he agrees. But here's the twisted part. Quagmire has been choking himself his whole life, so his neck is super strong. When Jeff tries to strangle him, it doesn't work. Quagmire breaks free and runs Jeff over with a truck, killing him. The fight scene is brutal and realistic. There's no cartoon violence here, it's just two men trying to kill each other. When Quagmire finally wins, there's no celebration or relief. It's just grim and necessary. The show doesn't glorify the violence at all. After Jeff's dead, they have to cover it up. They write a fake note saying Jeff left town, but even the note is threatening. It warns Brenda that if she tells anyone what really happened, Jeff will come back and murder her and calls her garbage. So, even dead, this guy is still terrorizing her. The fake note also includes weird random stuff like loving grape ape, which shows how the guys are struggling to make it sound authentic while dealing with having just committed murder. The ending is really messed up because Brenda doesn't feel free, she just feels lost. She's been abused for so long she doesn't know how to function without someone controlling her. The episode ends with her crying, not from relief but from confusion. That's the really dark part, the trauma stays with you. This episode was huge for Family Guy because it showed they could tackle serious stuff without making jokes about everything. It doesn't sugarcoat domestic violence at all. It shows how abusers destroy their victims mentally, how the system fails women in danger, and how sometimes good people do terrible things when they feel there's no other choice. The really uncomfortable part is that Joe straight up tells them the cops can't help until Jeff actually kills Brenda. This reflects the real problem with how domestic violence cases are handled. By the time the law gets involved, it's often too late. The episode criticizes a system that protects abusers more than victims. What makes Screams of Silence so dark is that it suggests sometimes violence is the only way to stop an abuser. Whether you think that's right or wrong, this episode shows the ugly reality of domestic violence and how it affects everyone around it. It's disturbing, controversial, and definitely one of the darkest things Family Guy ever put on TV. The fact that they had to kill someone to save Brenda says something really dark about how our society handles these situations. Family Guy went from exposing brutal abuse in Screams of Silence to suddenly killing off Brian in Life of Brian. Life of Brian. You know how some TV shows kill off characters and you kinda see it coming? Well, Life of Brian does the complete opposite. It sucker punches you when you least expect it. One minute Brian's playing street hockey with Stewie, and the next minute he's roadkill. The episode starts with typical Stewie and Brian time travel nonsense. They mess up history by giving guns to Native Americans in colonial times, which leads to Native Americans taking over America instead of white people. It's actually pretty funny seeing this alternate timeline where everything's reversed. Native Americans have casinos everywhere, and their music dominates the radio with this repetitive chanting song that's been #1 for 10,000 weeks straight. The whole alternate reality thing shows what would happen if colonization went the other way. You see, Native Americans running hospitals, having their own medical system, and basically being in charge of everything. Meanwhile, white people are the ones getting discriminated against and pushed around. It's dark social commentary wrapped up in their usual absurd humor. After they restore the timeline, Stewie makes this dramatic decision to destroy his time machine completely. He's sick of nearly dying every time they use it, so he takes a sledgehammer to the whole thing and dumps it at the junkyard. The time machine has been his greatest invention, but he's willing to give it up for safety. This decision seems smart at the time, but it becomes the worst mistake of his life. While they're at the junkyard, they spot this perfectly good street hockey net that someone tossed out. Brian gets excited about having a new hobby now that they're done with time travel. He's talking about getting fresh air and exercise instead of being cooped up inside working on inventions all day. The whole thing feels like a fresh start for both of them. They set up the net in their front yard and start playing. The game itself is pretty typical Brian and Stewie stuff. They're competitive but having fun, trash-talking each other in their usual way. Stewie makes jokes about only letting babies win, while Brian goes inside to get his knee pads. Everything feels normal and relaxed, just two friends enjoying themselves on a beautiful day. Then it happens. Brian goes inside to grab his knee pads, and as he's walking back out to continue playing, a car comes flying down their street way too fast. Stewie screams, "Brian, look out," but there's no time to react. The car slams into Brian at full speed and keeps driving without even stopping. The driver doesn't even slow down, just hits a dog and speeds away like nothing happened. What makes this scene so disturbing is how real it feels. Brian doesn't bounce back up like in typical cartoon violence. He's seriously hurt, bleeding everywhere, and clearly dying. Stewie's screaming and trying to help while the family rushes outside. You can see the panic in everyone's eyes because they know this is bad. The family scrambles to get Brian help, loading him into a car and rushing him to the veterinarian as fast as possible. The whole scene feels desperate and chaotic, like a real emergency. At the vet's office, they're all sitting in that horrible waiting room where families get bad news. The veterinarian comes out looking grim, and you know what's coming before he even speaks. He delivers the devastating news that Brian's injuries are too severe to save him. His bones are crushed, his internal organs are damaged, and there's nothing modern veterinary medicine can do. He tells the family to say their goodbyes because Brian doesn't have long. This hits like a punch to the gut because you realize the show is actually going through with this. Brian's death scene is absolutely brutal and feels nothing like typical Family Guy. He's hooked up to machines in this sterile vet office, barely conscious but trying to communicate with his family one last time. He's struggling to speak, clearly in pain, but he manages to tell them they gave him a wonderful life and that he loves them all. His voice is weak, and you can tell every word is an effort. When the heart monitor flatlines, the silence is deafening. Peter completely breaks down, crying that Brian was his best friend and like a brother. Lois is sobbing, the kids are devastated, and the whole family is destroyed by this loss. Right after Brian dies, Stewie has this horrible realization that destroys him psychologically. He could have saved Brian if he still had the time machine. Just hours earlier, he destroyed the one thing that could have prevented this tragedy. The irony is crushing. Stewie destroyed the time machine to keep them safe, but that decision directly led to Brian's death. Stewie desperately tries to rebuild the machine, frantically searching for the parts he needs. But when he contacts his supplier Yusuf, he gets devastating news. The guy who made titanium capacitors drew a doodle of Muhammad while talking on the phone, not even on purpose, just absent-mindedly, and got murdered for it. Without those specific parts, it's impossible to build a functioning time machine. Brian is gone forever. The funeral scene shows the real impact of losing Brian on the entire community. Peter gives this heartbreaking speech about losing his best friend, talking about how Brian was like a brother to him and how he'll spend the rest of his life missing him. You see grown men crying, which almost never happens in Family Guy. There's this weird moment at the funeral where this random black woman keeps hitting Joe with her purse, thinking he's supposed to solve Brian's death like it's a murder case. She keeps yelling about bringing the killer to justice and making sure Brian didn't die for nothing. It's both absurd and heartbreaking because she clearly cares more about a dog she never met than some people care about actual humans. A whole month passes and the family is still struggling with grief. Peter keeps almost serving Brian food out of habit. Chris keeps getting stuck in the doggy door because he's trying to fill the void Brian left. The house feels empty without Brian's intellectual conversations and his role as the family's moral compass. Lois finally suggests getting a new dog to help them heal, which brings them to the pet store. That's when they meet Vinny, a talking dog with a thick New Jersey accent and a completely different personality from Brian. Where Brian was intellectual and sophisticated, Vinny is street smart and crude. He talks about banging broads and makes Italian-American jokes. Peter immediately connects with him because Vinny's more like a regular guy than Brian ever was. Vinny quickly integrates into the family in ways that both help and hurt. He offers to cook dinner for Lois, which Brian never did. He becomes Peter's drinking buddy at the Drunken Clam, filling that social role Brian never really occupied. But his presence also highlights everything the family lost when Brian died. Stewie initially hates Vinny and sees him as a cheap replacement for Brian. He tries to kill Vinny by telling him tragic news about Italian Americans, hoping to give him a heart attack. Stewie feeds him stories about kids getting killed by falling pianos and other horrible fates befalling Italian families. But Chris ruins the plan by calling Stewie names, which actually makes Vinny happy instead of sad. The turning point comes when Vinny finds Stewie crying alone. Instead of ignoring it or making jokes, Vinny sits down and actually talks to the kid about grief and loss. He explains how his previous owner, Leo, died in this absurd yoga accident where his ball sack split in half during the first pose. It was such a weird death that it got covered on Dateline as a whole news story. Vinny's story about Leo helps Stewie understand that everyone deals with loss and that finding new people to care about doesn't mean forgetting the ones you lost. Vinny explains that when he saw the Griffin family at the pet store, he recognized that they were going through the same feelings of loss that he experienced when Leo died. The episode ends with Vinny staying in Stewie's room for the night, showing that their bond is starting to develop. But it's not the same relationship Stewie had with Brian, it's something completely different. Vinny can't replace Brian's role as Stewie's intellectual equal and time travel partner. What made Life of Brian so dark was how it handled death realistically. Brian had been a core character since day one, representing the voice of reason in the Griffin household. Killing him off changed the entire show dynamic permanently and showed that nobody was safe from getting killed off. The episode proved that sometimes bad things happen for absolutely no good reason, and even beloved characters can die in the most mundane ways possible. After killing Brian in Life of Brian with real tragedy, Family Guy switched to Seahorse Seashell Party, where the shock came from Meg finally standing up to her family. Seahorse Seashell Party. Sometimes the worst Family Guy episodes are the ones that hit too close to home. Seahorse Seashell Party takes place during a hurricane when the Griffin family gets trapped inside together, and what starts as typical family boredom turns into Meg having a complete mental breakdown where she finally tells everyone exactly what kind of people they really are. The whole thing starts during Hurricane Flozell that forces the Griffin family to stay inside their house for 36 hours. They're stuck together with no TV, no internet, nothing to do but interact with each other. While this is happening, Brian decides to take magic mushrooms to pass the time, which sends him on this terrifying drug trip with hallucinations and nightmares throughout the episode. The family tries to entertain themselves with games like charades, but they're all getting on each other's nerves. Peter does his annoying dad noises routine, where he just makes gross sounds for several minutes. Then they play this finger gun game where they pretend to shoot each other, but when Meg tries to join in, Peter immediately shuts her down, saying nobody wants to get finger banged by her. That's when something snaps in Meg. She's had enough of being treated like garbage by her own family. Instead of just taking it like she usually does, Meg explodes and tells everyone exactly what she thinks of them, and she doesn't hold back at all. First, she goes after Chris for being a terrible brother. She tears into him about how he's supposed to be on her side, but instead he treats her like he hates her. Meg points out that Chris constantly says hurtful things to her and joins in on all the family bullying. She asks him how he'd feel if she started calling him a fat, zitty loser who has no friends and smells like an old woman who has birds for pets. Chris is completely shocked because nobody's ever called him out like this before. Then Meg turns her attention to Lois, and this is where things get really dark. She calls out Lois for being a hypocrite who acts like a moral authority while having this history of shoplifting, drug addiction, porn, and sleeping around with celebrities. But the worst part is when Meg gets into the psychological damage Lois has caused her. Meg tells Lois that from the moment she was born, she had to trust her mother completely. She needed Lois to protect her and guide her through life. Instead, Lois spent 17 years on a mission to destroy something that you killed a long time ago. Meg says that when she turns 18, she doesn't know if she ever wants to see Lois again. This breaks Lois completely. She starts crying and admits she's been a terrible mother. But Meg's not done. She goes after Peter next, and she absolutely destroys him. She calls him a fat, lazy, abusive, blue-collar Irish Catholic dad who drinks way too much and barely makes enough money to support his family. She tells him he's lived half his life with nothing to show for it except his kids, and even they turned out to be disasters. Meg points out that Peter is completely selfish and irresponsible. She brings up how he literally shoves her face in his butt and farts on her, saying if anyone from the outside world saw how he treats her, he'd be in jail. She calls him a total and complete embarrassment in every possible way, and a waste of a man. The family completely falls apart after Meg's breakdown. Everyone starts attacking each other instead of ganging up on Meg like they usually do. Peter and Lois get into this huge fight about everything from food to sex. Chris joins in, complaining about his mother's cooking and how Peter eats all the yogurt. The whole family structure collapses without Meg as their scapegoat. Peter gets so upset he runs away and hides in the closet with the shoes, crying that he doesn't deserve better. The family is in complete chaos, yelling at each other and falling apart. This is when Meg has this horrible realization about her role in the family. Brian finds Meg and tells her it was cool how she finally stood up for herself, but Meg realizes that the family literally cannot function without someone to abuse. She figures out that maybe her role is to be the lightning rod that absorbs all the family's dysfunction so they don't have to turn on each other. Meanwhile, throughout all this family drama, Brian is having the worst drug trip of his life. He's seeing terrifying hallucinations of his family members as monsters, devils singing nursery rhymes, and all kinds of nightmarish visions. Stewie has to babysit him through the whole experience, which adds this surreal layer to an already intense episode. So Meg does something that's either incredibly noble or incredibly depressing. She takes it all back. She goes to her family and apologizes for everything she said. She tells them they're all amazing and that she was wrong to blame them for her problems. She says it was all her fault and takes responsibility for the entire breakdown. The family immediately goes back to normal, with Peter feeling better about himself and everyone happy to have their punching bag back. Meg accepts being called a fucking bitch by her own father and agrees with him that yes, she is exactly that. The really disturbing part is that Meg makes this conscious choice to sacrifice her own mental health for the family's stability. She becomes a martyr who absorbs all their toxicity so they can function. Brian tells her she might be the strongest person in the house, but you have to wonder if she's actually the most damaged. This episode shows how abusive family dynamics really work. Meg serves a specific function as the scapegoat who allows everyone else to feel better about themselves. When she stops playing that role, the entire family system breaks down because they need someone to blame for all their problems. The episode ends with Stewie doing a parody of those very special episode PSAs about drug use, which is darkly funny considering the real issue was never Brian's mushroom trip but the family's psychological abuse of their own daughter. The long-term impact was huge because it showed that Family Guy understood exactly how toxic the Griffin family dynamic was. Meg was being psychologically destroyed, and they made it clear that this was intentional. The episode basically said that some families are so broken they need a victim to function, and that victim has to choose between their own sanity and keeping the family together. After showing how Meg is crushed into being her family's scapegoat in Seahorse Seashell Party, Family Guy pushed things even further in Partial Terms of Endearment by tackling abortion with no filter. Partial Terms of Endearment. Family Guy went completely nuclear with this episode and basically touched every single hot-button issue around abortion you can think of. Partial Terms of Endearment starts with what seems like Peter's dream scenario but turns into a nightmare debate about pregnancy, surrogacy, and ultimately abortion when everything goes horribly wrong. The whole mess begins at Lois's college reunion, where she runs into her old friend Naomi and her husband Dale. Peter immediately thinks this is going to be some kind of threesome situation because he finds out Lois experimented with Naomi back in college. He spends the entire dinner trying to set up porn scenarios, doing pizza delivery guy routines, and other ridiculous attempts to get an orgy started. But Naomi and Dale aren't there for Peter's fantasies. They have a much more serious request. They want Lois to be their surrogate mother. The couple has been trying to have kids for years, but Naomi's eggs won't attach properly, so they need someone else to carry their baby. They specifically chose Lois because they trust her and think she'd be a good surrogate. Lois is honored by the request, but knows it's a huge decision. Peter is completely against it from the start, not wanting to deal with 9 months of pregnancy just to hand the baby over to someone else. He makes crude jokes about Lois's body being like a Red Roof Inn and tries everything he can to talk her out of it. Despite Peter's objections, Lois decides to go through with the surrogacy. She gets the fertility treatments and becomes pregnant with Naomi and Dale's baby. Peter is furious and starts doing increasingly dangerous things to try to cause a miscarriage. He hires break dancers to dance on her stomach, tries to get her to drink bleach, and does other insane stunts to end the pregnancy. Then, everything changes when tragedy strikes. Naomi and Dale are killed in a car accident, leaving Lois pregnant with a baby that no longer has parents. The couple had won the lottery on the same day they died, which makes the whole situation even more surreal and tragic. Now Lois is stuck carrying a baby for people who are dead, with no plan for what to do when it's born. The family discusses their options, and Brian suggests that abortion might be the most practical solution given the circumstances. Lois is torn because she's already several months along and has been thinking of this as Naomi and Dale's baby, not her own. Peter initially agrees that abortion makes sense, but everything changes when they go to the clinic. While Lois is inside talking to the doctor, Peter encounters pro-life protesters outside who show him an anti-abortion video. The video is completely over-the-top propaganda featuring Ziggy the Zygote and claims that aborted fetuses could have been the person who killed Hitler or prevented 9/11. The video completely brainwashes Peter, and he storms into the clinic to save the baby. He becomes this militant pro-life activist overnight, spouting all the typical talking points about how abortion is murder and life begins at conception. Lois points out how hypocritical he is. He's suddenly pro-life, but wouldn't actually adopt an unwanted baby or take care of it after birth. This leads to a huge fight between Peter and Lois about abortion rights. Peter takes the extreme pro-life position, while Lois argues for her right to choose what happens to her body. Peter even threatens to bomb the clinic if Lois goes back for the abortion, which shows how radicalized he's become by one propaganda video. The argument gets intense when they discuss edge cases like rape and incest. Peter makes horrible jokes about both situations, showing he hasn't really thought through his position at all. When Lois asks what they'd do if the ultrasound showed the baby would be born without arms and legs, Peter just says, "You name it, Matt," completely missing the point about quality of life issues. Brian tries to be the voice of reason, explaining that the fetus isn't viable yet and doesn't have brain activity until around 27 weeks. But Peter has been completely taken in by the emotional manipulation of the anti-abortion propaganda and refuses to listen to science or logic. The episode ends with one of the darkest twists in Family Guy history. After all the fighting and moral debates, Lois and Peter go upstairs to have a long discussion about what to do. They come back down and Peter gives this speech about how hard it is to raise a baby, all the costs, sleepless nights, college tuition, and sacrifices. But then, he says it's worth it to have another little griffin to love. Then comes the punchline: we had the abortion. Despite everything Peter said about the sanctity of life and protecting the unborn, they went through with ending the pregnancy anyway. It's a brutal ending that shows how people's actual decisions often don't match their political rhetoric when they're facing real consequences. The episode was so controversial that many networks refused to air it. It tackles abortion, surrogacy, religious extremism, and political hypocrisy all in one episode. The show doesn't really take a clear side. It makes both pro-life and pro-choice positions look ridiculous in different ways. What makes this episode particularly dark is how it shows how easily people can be manipulated by propaganda and how quickly someone's moral positions can change based on circumstances. Peter goes from practical acceptance of abortion to militant pro-life activism and back to practical acceptance, all within one episode, showing how shallow political positions can be when they're not based on real conviction. The episode basically argues that the abortion debate is full of people who don't really understand the complexity of real situations and are more interested in ideological purity than helping actual families deal with impossible choices. After tackling abortion and hypocrisy in partial terms of endearment, Family Guy went full horror with And Then There Were Fewer, a murder mystery where big characters were killed off for good. If you're enjoying the video so far, consider subscribing to our channel. And Then There Were Fewer. Family Guy turned into a straight-up horror movie with this episode, and honestly, it's one of the most ambitious things they ever tried. And Then There Were Fewer is basically Agatha Christie's And Then There Were None, but with all your favorite Quahog characters getting picked off one by one in a creepy mansion. The whole thing starts when everyone in town gets mysterious invitations to a fancy dinner party at Rocky Point Manor. Peter thinks it's in his honor, but so does everyone else. Joe, Quagmire, Mayor West, Dr. Hartman, Tom Tucker, Diane Simmons, and basically the entire cast of side characters all show up thinking they're the guest of honor. Nobody knows who sent the invitations, which should have been the first red flag. When they arrive at this spooky mansion on an isolated island, they discover their host is James Woods with his new girlfriend Priscilla. Woods claims he's become a born-again Christian and wants to make amends with everyone he's wronged over the years. The guy has apparently screwed over literally everyone in town in different ways, so this dinner is supposed to be his big apology tour. But this is James Woods we're talking about, so nobody trusts him. The whole setup feels like a trap, and everyone's on edge, waiting for him to pull something. The mansion is isolated on an island, there's a storm brewing, and the whole atmosphere is classic horror movie stuff. You can feel something terrible is about to happen just from the creepy setting alone. Then everything goes to hell when Priscilla gets shot in the head while sitting in James Woods' chair. A hidden gun was set up to fire at that exact spot, but she was in the wrong place, at the wrong time. Blood goes everywhere, and everyone immediately assumes Woods set this up and is trying to kill them all. They panic and try to escape, but the storm has destroyed the bridge and flooded the roads, so they're trapped on the island with what they think is a murderer. When the power goes out, someone stabs James Woods to death with a dinner knife right in front of everyone. Now, everyone realizes Woods wasn't the killer since he's dead too. The real murderer is one of them, hiding among the group and picking people off. This is where the episode becomes a full murder mystery, with everyone suspecting each other and trying to figure out who the killer is before they become the next victim. The deaths keep piling up in increasingly brutal ways. Muriel Goldman gets stabbed with the same knife that killed Woods. Derek gets his skull crushed with a Golden Globe award and gets thrown off the roof. Each death is more shocking than the last because these are characters we've known for years, and the show actually treats their deaths seriously instead of making jokes about them. Tom Tucker becomes the main suspect when they find the murder weapon hidden in his room, along with Priscilla's body. All the evidence points to him, and everyone's ready to believe he's the killer. The episode does a great job making him look guilty while keeping you guessing about what's really happening. Everyone's paranoid and turning on each other in ways that feel genuinely scary. The episode does a great job of giving multiple characters motives for wanting James Woods dead. Tom Tucker lost his acting career because Woods gave him bad advice. Seamus got turned into a half-sea captain because Woods thought he was a steak while they were on acid and tried to eat him. Mayor West is mad about some Twitter handle thing. Dr. Hartman had his nephew get molested by Woods. Everyone has legitimate reasons to hate the guy and want him dead. The whole thing plays out like a classic whodunit, with characters getting picked off and everyone trying to solve the mystery before they're next. Peter takes over the investigation when Joe gets knocked out, which leads to some funny moments with him using a giant magnifying glass and acting like he knows what he's doing. But even the comedy feels darker than usual because people are actually dying. They eventually corner Tom Tucker and assume he's the killer because all the evidence points to him. The mob mentality kicks in and everyone's ready to turn him over to the police. You really believe Tom did it because the setup is so convincing and he seems to have the strongest motive for revenge. But right at the end, there's this huge twist that changes everything. Lois figures out the real killer is Diane Simmons, the news anchor who's been there the whole time, acting innocent and helping with the investigation. She seemed like the most trustworthy person there, which makes the reveal even more shocking. Diane's motive is absolutely brutal and shows how far someone will go for revenge. She was having a secret affair with James Woods, but when she turned 40, both Woods and her news station dumped her for younger women. Her whole career and love life got destroyed at the same time, and she couldn't handle it. So she orchestrated this entire weekend as an elaborate revenge plot against both Woods and Tom Tucker. The planning that went into this is insane. Diane paid Priscilla to seduce Woods and convince him to become religious, so he'd want to make amends with everyone. The whole dinner party was Diane's setup to murder Woods and frame Tom Tucker for it. She wanted to destroy both men who ruined her life in one perfectly planned weekend. But everything went wrong from the start, when Priscilla sat in the wrong chair and got shot instead of Woods. So Diane had to improvise and kill Woods with the knife during the blackout. Then she had to kill Priscilla because she might have figured out what was really going on. When Muriel caught Diane planting evidence in Tom's room, she had to die too. Derek got killed because he was about to call the police and ruin everything. Each murder was Diane covering up the last one, trying to keep her plan on track, while everything spiraled out of control. She played the helpful news anchor perfectly, even comforting other people and acting shocked at each death, while secretly being the one behind all of it. The reveal is genuinely chilling because Diane confesses everything to Lois in this cold, matter-of-fact way. She talks about killing all these people like she's reading the news, completely emotionless about the lives she's destroyed. Her confession shows how much rage and bitterness she was hiding behind her professional news anchor persona. What makes it even darker is that Diane's revenge was ultimately about ageism and sexism. She got pushed out of her job and her relationship just for turning 40, while men like Tom Tucker and James Woods got to keep their careers and date younger women. Her murderous rampage was basically her way of fighting back against a system that threw her away for getting older. The episode ends with Stewie shooting Diane before she can kill Lois. His reason is classic Stewie. If anybody's gonna take that bitch down, it's gonna be me. It's a darkly funny way to end what's basically been a straight horror movie for the past hour. What made this episode so dark was how it treated death seriously for once. These weren't cartoon deaths where characters bounce back next episode. People were genuinely murdered, and the episode dealt with the real horror and paranoia of being trapped with a killer. The atmosphere was genuinely creepy throughout, and the mystery was well constructed with real clues and red herrings that actually made sense. The episode also showed how easily people turn on each other when they're scared. Everyone was ready to believe anyone else was the killer based on the smallest amount of evidence. They almost lynched Tom Tucker based on circumstantial evidence and mob mentality. It was pretty dark commentary on how quickly civilized people can become animals when they're afraid for their lives. This was Family Guy doing something completely different and proving they could handle serious storytelling when they wanted to. It was a feature-length murder mystery that actually worked as both comedy and horror, showing the writers could craft a real plot with genuine suspense and shocking twists while still keeping the show's signature humor. After shocking fans with real murders and paranoia in And Then There Were Fewer, Family Guy got just as dark in The Thin White Line by dragging Brian into cocaine addiction and showing how fast it destroys everything. The Thin White Line. The Thin White Line shows Brian Griffin becoming a drug-sniffing police dog and getting addicted to cocaine while working undercover. This episode demonstrates how quickly someone can fall into addiction and how it destroys relationships with family and friends. Brian starts the episode feeling empty and bored with his life. He's stuck in a depressive rut, watching the same Behind the Music episode about Leif Garrett 18 times in a row. He can't even think of a reason to get out of bed in the morning. His life feels pathetic and meaningless. When he goes to his therapist, Bruce, he gets advice to stop being so inwardly focused and try thinking about others through volunteer work. The turning point comes during Mr. Weed's company picnic. Joe Swanson, the local police officer, notices Brian's incredible sense of smell when Brian correctly identifies that Joe's wife made chicken marsala 3 nights earlier just by smelling Joe from a distance. Joe realizes this amazing nose could make Brian a perfect drug-sniffing dog for the police force. Brian agrees to join the team, looking for something to give his life purpose and excitement. Brian's first day on the job is a massive success. He helps the police bust a major drug operation, finding kilos of pure Colombian cocaine worth over $1 million. The rush of the successful bust gives Brian the thrill he's been searching for. He becomes a local hero, with news coverage celebrating his crime-fighting abilities. His enhanced senses allow him to detect drugs everywhere, making him incredibly valuable to the police department. But this is where The Thin White Line takes a dark turn. Brian starts sampling the drugs during raids. At first, it seems harmless, just a little taste to make sure it's the real deal. The cocaine gives him the excitement and energy he's been missing in his life. He tells himself he's just doing his job properly, but really he's feeding a growing addiction. The drug makes him feel confident, alert, and alive in ways he hasn't experienced in years. Brian becomes obsessed with drug busts, and he wants more of it. His work performance initially improves because he's so motivated to find cocaine, but his reasons are completely selfish. He's using his position as a police dog to feed his own habit while pretending to serve justice. The cocaine addiction rapidly changes Brian's personality. He becomes paranoid, aggressive, and incredibly mean to his family. He brings home a sketchy drug-addicted girlfriend named Tina, who immediately starts insulting everyone in the Griffin house. She calls Lois a Stepford wife and refers to Chris and Meg as Quasimodo and Lumpy. Brian not only allows this abuse, but encourages it, completely abandoning his usual role as the family's voice of reason. Brian's paranoia reaches dangerous levels. He starts seeing drug dealers everywhere, even busting a Sunday school class because he thinks the children are actually drug-dealing midgets in disguise. His judgment is completely gone, and he's putting innocent people in danger because of his drug-fueled delusions. The police department starts questioning his methods as he becomes increasingly erratic and violent during arrests. The episode shows how addiction isolates people from those who care about them. Brian becomes cruel to his family members, insulting them and prioritizing his drug use over their relationships. When Peter tries to reconnect with him through their old friendship routines, Brian shows no interest. He's lost all empathy and connection to the people who love him most. The family eventually stages an intervention after watching Brian's behavior spiral completely out of control. Peter tells Brian he misses when they used to be best friends and sidekicks, back when they had fun together and supported each other. Lois explains how Brian has become a jerk since his addiction started, treating everyone around him with contempt and cruelty. Even the kids notice how different and mean he's become compared to the caring, intelligent dog they used to know. During the intervention, Brian finally breaks down and admits he needs help. The cocaine has completely taken over his life, and he can't stop using even though he knows it's destroying everything important to him. His admission is one of the most genuine emotional moments in early Family Guy, showing real vulnerability and desperation rather than the show's usual cynical humor. Brian checks into a fancy rehabilitation center that looks more like a luxury resort than a medical facility. The place has tennis courts, spas, and jacuzzis, making recovery seem almost glamorous. But this upscale setting becomes problematic when Peter shows up pretending to be an addict too, because he wants to vacation there. Peter doesn't understand the seriousness of addiction treatment and sees the whole thing as a fun getaway. Peter's presence at the rehab facility creates serious problems for Brian's recovery. Instead of focusing on his therapy sessions and getting clean, Brian gets tempted to skip treatment and goof around with Peter. They play pranks on pregnant teenagers and treat the whole experience like a vacation rather than life-saving medical treatment. This shows how enabling relationships can sabotage recovery even when they come from people who care about you. The episode gets really dark when it reveals how Brian's addiction affected his work as a police dog. He wasn't actually helping catch criminals, he was just feeding his own habit while wearing a badge. His drug use compromised investigations and put other officers at risk. When the police department realizes he's been using the evidence he was supposed to find, they fire him immediately. His career in law enforcement ends in complete disgrace. Brian's therapist at the rehab center identifies Peter as Brian's X factor, the negative influence that enables his destructive behavior. While Peter isn't directly responsible for Brian's addiction, their codependent friendship creates situations where Brian makes bad choices. The therapist suggests that Brian needs to distance himself from Peter to maintain his sobriety. This creates the episode's most painful conflict. Brian has to choose between his best friend and his recovery. Peter represents fun, adventure, and irresponsibility, all things that fed into Brian's addictive behavior. Even though Peter genuinely cares about Brian and took him in as family, their relationship has become toxic for Brian's mental health and sobriety. What makes The Thin White Line so brutal is how it shows addiction destroying someone who was supposed to be the smart, rational member of the family. Brian went from being the voice of reason to being completely out of control. His intelligence didn't protect him from addiction. If anything, it made him better at rationalizing his drug use and manipulating situations to get more cocaine. The episode doesn't make addiction look glamorous or funny. While there are comedic moments, the core story shows the real consequences of drug addiction: losing your job, hurting your family, becoming violent and paranoid, and losing control of your life completely. Brian's transformation from caring family member to cruel addict demonstrates how drugs can change someone's fundamental personality. The ending of The Thin White Line is bittersweet because Brian gets sober, but he also has to leave the Griffin family to stay that way. He realizes that his relationship with Peter, while loving, has been enabling his destructive behavior patterns. To maintain his sobriety, he needs to remove himself from familiar triggers and situations that might lead him back to drugs. Brian's departure represents one of the most mature decisions any Family Guy character has ever made. He's choosing long-term health over short-term comfort, even though it means leaving behind everything familiar. The episode ends with Brian getting in a taxi to start a new life somewhere else, away from the people and places associated with his addiction. The Thin White Line stands out as one of Family Guy's most serious episodes because it treats addiction as a real disease rather than a punchline. The message is clear: addiction can happen to anyone, even the smartest person in the room, and recovery requires making hard choices about the people and situations in your life. Sometimes getting better means leaving behind relationships that aren't healthy for you, even when those relationships involve people you love. Brian's drug addiction destroyed his family relationships, but his inappropriate kiss with teenage Meg crossed an even worse line. But before I tell you about that, subscribe to our channel, Barely Legal. Barely Legal puts Brian Griffin in a really messed up situation when he makes out with teenage Meg Griffin at a school dance and she becomes obsessed with him. This episode explores what happens when an adult gets involved with a minor and how quickly things can go completely wrong. The episode starts with Meg feeling desperate and suicidal about not having a date to her school dance. She threatens to kill herself if no one will go with her, which forces Brian into agreeing to take her. Brian sees this as just helping out a family member who's struggling with feeling bad about herself. He doesn't want anything romantic and just wants to stop Meg from hurting herself. At the school dance, Brian gets really drunk while watching Meg get bullied by popular students. When mean girl Connie tells Meg to leave because no dogs are allowed, Brian loses it and completely destroys Connie with insults. He calls her a whore who peaked early and will be washed up by age 19. Meg is amazed that someone finally stood up for her, which makes her see Brian as her hero and protector. The alcohol makes Brian's judgment terrible. When Meg thanks him for defending her, Brian kisses her. They make out at the school dance in front of other students. Brian is a grown adult kissing a 17-year-old girl who sees him like a father figure. The whole thing is completely screwed up, and Brian knows it's wrong even while it's happening. The next morning, Meg is totally obsessed with Brian and wants to be his girlfriend. She starts calling him cute names and asking him on dates. Brian realizes he's created a huge problem and tries to back away, but Meg won't listen. She's convinced they have a real relationship now and that Brian loves her back. Her obsession gets worse by the hour. Brian tries everything to avoid Meg. He tells her he might be gay, that he has plans with Chris, anything to get away from her. But Meg thinks everything is just Brian playing hard to get or being shy about their relationship. She tells her friends that Brian is her serious boyfriend and brags about dating an older man. The situation gets more twisted when Meg starts acting like a normal teenage girl with her first boyfriend, not understanding that what happened was completely wrong. Things get really dark when Meg starts baking pies with her hair inside them and making Brian eat them. She tells him, "Part of me is inside of you now," while he's eating her hair without knowing it. This shows how her obsession has turned into something truly disturbing and manipulative. She's trying to create a physical connection with Brian by literally making him eat parts of her body. Brian finally tries to set clear boundaries by having someone help him explain that they're not boyfriend and girlfriend and never will be. But Meg completely ignores this and responds by kidnapping Brian. She ties him up, throws him in the trunk of his car, and drives him to some remote place where she can have him all to herself. When the family finds them, Peter immediately thinks Brian is a predator who's been grooming Meg. He screams, "Brian, she's a teenager," like Brian is some kind of child molester. The episode treats this moment seriously, showing how society views adults who get involved with minors romantically. Even though Brian was drunk and made a terrible mistake, it looks like he's an adult who went after a child. The episode ends with Quagmire giving Meg advice about not growing up too fast and how she has plenty of time for relationships when she's older. This is weird coming from Quagmire, who's usually shown as a sexual predator himself, but it shows that even he knows what happened between Brian and Meg was wrong. What makes Barely Legal so disturbing is how it shows how easily a wrong relationship can develop between an adult and teenager. Brian never meant to hurt Meg, but his bad judgment while drinking created a situation where a vulnerable teenager became obsessed with him. The episode shows how teenagers can think adult kindness means romance, especially when they're desperate for attention and love. The power balance is completely messed up throughout the episode. Brian is basically Meg's uncle who lives in her house and has known her since she was a child. When he kisses her, he's breaking the trust that comes with being a family member and authority figure. Meg can't really agree to this relationship because she's a minor and Brian has power over her as an adult in her house. The episode also shows how these wrong relationships can be justified by both people involved. Brian tells himself he was just drunk and it didn't mean anything, while Meg convinces herself that Brian really loves her and they're meant to be together. Both of them avoid facing the reality that what happened was wrong and harmful. Barely Legal also demonstrates how teenage girls can become dangerously obsessed when they think they're in love. Meg goes from being grateful for Brian's kindness to completely losing her mind over him. She starts stalking him, putting her hair in his food, and eventually kidnapping him. This shows how quickly teenage emotions can escalate into dangerous behavior when mixed with inappropriate adult attention. The episode is particularly dark because it shows how one moment of poor judgment can destroy lives. Brian's decision to kiss Meg while drunk creates a situation that could have ruined both of them. If the relationship had continued, Brian could have faced criminal charges for getting involved with a minor, while Meg could have been emotionally damaged for years. What's most uncomfortable about Barely Legal is how realistic the setup feels. Many adults have been in situations where they're trying to help a struggling teenager, and the boundaries can become blurry. The episode shows how easy it is for things to go wrong when alcohol, emotional vulnerability, and poor judgment combine. The family's reaction when they discover what happened also feels realistic. Lois is furious with Brian and physically attacks him, while Peter immediately assumes the worst about Brian's intentions. This shows how society views adults who cross lines with minors, even when the circumstances are complicated. Barely Legal stands out as one of Family Guy's darkest episodes because it deals with adult-minor relationships without making it into a complete joke. While there are funny moments, the main situation is treated as genuinely problematic and uncomfortable. The episode shows how quickly things can get out of control when boundaries are crossed between adults and minors, and how difficult it can be to fix the damage once it's done. Brian's moment of bad judgment creates a situation that could have destroyed both their lives if it had continued, making it one of the most serious storylines the show ever tackled. After showing Brian cross a moral line with Meg in Barely Legal and turning a disturbing mistake into obsession, Family Guy doubled down on darkness in Baby Not On Board by abandoning Stewie and forcing a 1-year-old to survive completely alone. Baby Not On Board. Baby Not On Board shows the Griffin family accidentally leaving baby Stewie home alone when they go on vacation to the Grand Canyon. The episode deals with child abandonment and shows how a 1-year-old baby tries to survive completely by himself for several days. The episode starts with the family getting ready for a vacation trip. Peter gets a free gas card from a spa after threatening to sue them, so he decides to take the whole family to the Grand Canyon. Everyone packs up early in the morning at 6 a.m., but in all the rush and chaos of getting ready, nobody notices that Stewie isn't in the car when they drive away. The family drives for hours, talking and singing songs together before anyone realizes what happened. When they finally figure out that Stewie is missing, Peter actually thinks it's hilarious. He laughs about how Stewie is probably freaking out at home and says he would give anything to see his face. Lois is horrified and wants to turn around immediately, but Peter doesn't want to ruin the whole vacation. They try calling Cleveland and Quagmire to check on Stewie, but both guys get captured and tied up in the basement by Stewie, who thinks they're intruders. So now there's no adult supervision at all, and a baby is completely alone in a house for days without any help coming. Meanwhile, Stewie has to figure out how to survive on his own. He runs out of food, diapers, and everything else he needs to live. The episode shows him trying to change his own diaper, but not knowing how to do it properly. He gets so desperate for money that he gets a job at a fast food restaurant, but even that goes wrong when he gets fired for stealing food. The family's journey back home becomes a disaster. They get stuck in New York with no money after Peter wastes their cash on useless junk. They have to hitchhike in the back of a truck to get home. The whole time, Lois is going crazy with worry about leaving their baby alone, but Peter keeps making jokes about it and acting like it's no big deal. The episode shows how dangerous it is to leave a small child alone. Stewie could have gotten seriously hurt or died during those days by himself. He had no way to call for help, no food, no clean diapers, and nobody checking on him. Any number of accidents could have happened. He could have fallen downstairs, gotten into dangerous chemicals, started a fire, or hurt himself in countless ways. When the family finally gets home, Stewie runs to them crying, "Mommy, Daddy," because he's so relieved and scared. He tells them he thought he was going to die and that his life was much better when his family was around, even though he usually hates them. The experience traumatized him and made him realize how much he actually needs his parents to survive. What makes this episode really dark is how realistic the child abandonment scenario feels. Families do sometimes accidentally leave kids behind during hectic travel situations, and the consequences can be deadly. The episode shows how quickly a child can be forgotten in the chaos of daily life, and how parents can be so focused on their own problems that they ignore their children's basic needs. The episode also highlights how selfish and irresponsible Peter is as a father. Even after realizing they left Stewie alone, Peter's main concern is not missing his vacation. He treats the whole situation like a joke, instead of understanding that his baby could die without adult care. This shows a disturbing level of neglect and indifference toward his own child's safety. Lois tries to be the responsible parent, but she still goes along with Peter's decision to continue the vacation instead of immediately turning around. This shows how even well-meaning parents can make terrible decisions that put their children at risk when they're influenced by selfish partners. The episode demonstrates how children are completely dependent on adults for their survival. Stewie is smart for a baby, but he still can't properly take care of himself because he's physically too small and young. He needs constant supervision, regular feeding, diaper changes, and protection from dangers that adults take for granted. The working conditions Stewie faces as a baby trying to earn money are also disturbing. He gets exploited by his fast food employer who fires him for taking expired food that was about to be thrown away anyway. This shows how desperate his situation became and how adults in positions of power can take advantage of vulnerable children who have no other options. During his time alone, Stewie also runs out of clean clothes and ends up wearing Meg's hat, which shows how his basic hygiene and clothing needs weren't being met. He talks to his stuffed animal Rupert about how they're doomed and how he didn't realize how much better his life was with his family around until it was too late. This kind of existential fear and desperation is really heavy stuff for a baby character to experience. The episode shows the psychological impact of abandonment on children. Stewie goes through different emotional stages during his ordeal. First, he's confused and angry. Then he becomes resourceful and tries to solve his problems. Then he gets desperate and scared. And finally, he becomes deeply appreciative of his family when they return. This emotional journey reflects what real abandoned children go through when left to fend for themselves. The fact that Cleveland and Quagmire end up trapped in the basement also shows how Stewie's survival instincts kicked in, but in a dangerous way. He saw them as threats rather than help because he was in such a panicked state. This demonstrates how traumatic experiences can make children defensive and suspicious of adults who might actually be trying to help them. Peter's complete lack of parental instincts throughout the episode is really shocking. Most parents would immediately panic and turn around the moment they realized their baby was missing. Peter's reaction to laugh and want to continue the vacation shows a level of selfishness and neglect that borders on abuse. His priorities are completely backwards, caring more about his own fun than his child's safety. The episode also shows how financial stress can impact family decisions in dangerous ways. When Peter wastes their money on stupid purchases, it forces the family to take risky transportation options to get home. This delays their return even more and prolongs Stewie's dangerous situation. It shows how poor decision-making by parents can have cascading effects that put children at greater risk. Baby Not on Board is one of Family Guy's darkest episodes because it shows realistic child endangerment without making light of the serious consequences. While there are funny moments, the core situation is genuinely frightening and shows how quickly parental neglect can turn life-threatening. The episode serves as a reminder that children's safety should always come first, and that parents have a responsibility to protect their kids that goes beyond their own convenience or entertainment. The lasting impact on Stewie is clear. He becomes more clingy and appreciative of his family after nearly dying alone. The episode shows how abandonment and neglect can cause real psychological trauma in children, even very young ones who might not remember the details but still carry the emotional scars. The experience fundamentally changes how Stewie views his relationship with his family, making him realize that despite all their problems, he needs them to survive and be safe. After showing Peter neglect his kid in Baby Not on Board, Family Guy went even darker in Turban Cowboy, pulling him into terrorism and racial prejudice. Turban Cowboy. Turban Cowboy shows Peter Griffin accidentally joining a terrorist cell after befriending a Muslim man named Mahmoud in the hospital. The episode deals with terrorism plots and racial prejudice against Muslims in post-9/11 America. The episode starts with Peter, Joe, and Quagmire feeling bored with their lives and deciding to try skydiving for excitement. During one of his jumps, Peter crashes and ends up in the hospital with injuries. While recovering, he meets Mahmoud, a Muslim patient wearing a traditional prayer cap called a taqiyya. Peter initially admits he's scared of Mahmoud's hat because he doesn't understand it, but they quickly become friends. Mahmoud introduces Peter to Muslim culture, taking him to Middle Eastern restaurants and teaching him about Islamic traditions. Peter becomes fascinated with what he sees as the benefits of Muslim life, especially how obedient Mahmoud's wife is compared to Lois. Peter decides to convert to Islam and starts dressing in traditional Muslim clothing and attending prayer meetings. His friends Brian, Joe, and Quagmire are uncomfortable with his new Muslim friend and make racist comments, but Peter defends Mahmoud and accuses them of post-9/11 prejudice. Peter becomes completely absorbed in his new religion and starts acting like a stereotypical Muslim convert. Mahmoud then invites Peter to a secret meeting with other Muslim men in a basement. Peter thinks he's just joining a normal religious gathering, but the men are actually planning a terrorist attack on the Quahog Bridge. They discuss loading a van with explosives and driving it to the bridge during rush hour to cause maximum casualties. The terrorists want Peter to drive the bomb-filled van because, as an American, he'll look less suspicious at police checkpoints. Peter doesn't understand what's really happening and agrees to help. When he tells his friends about the bridge plan, they realize he's accidentally joined a terrorist cell and convince him to wear a wire to gather evidence. During the next meeting, Peter tries to get more details about the bombing plot for the police, but the terrorists discover his wire and realize he's been spying on them. They force Peter at gunpoint to drive the explosive van toward the bridge immediately instead of waiting for rush hour. As Peter drives toward the target with Mahmoud holding a gun on him, he tries to talk his friend out of the attack. Peter gives a speech about what makes America great, mentioning everything from IHOP fights to Twitter spelling mistakes. He argues that America has problems but also represents freedom and opportunity that shouldn't be destroyed. Just before they reach the bridge, Joe and the police surround the van and arrest Mahmoud and the other terrorists. Peter is rescued unharmed, and Joe mentions that 30 terrorists were captured because of Peter's undercover work. The episode ends with the friends going for drinks to celebrate, though Joe makes a dark joke about how all the middle-class Arabs in town are now under suspicion. What makes this episode particularly controversial is how it handles serious topics like terrorism and Islamophobia. The show tries to criticize both extremist violence and anti-Muslim prejudice, but it does so through crude humor and stereotypes. Peter's friends make openly racist comments about Muslims, while the Muslim characters are portrayed as either terrorists or extremely submissive wives. The episode aired in 2013, more than a decade after 9/11, but it shows how fears about Islamic terrorism were still shaping American culture. The plot reflects real anxieties about sleeper cells and homegrown terrorists that were common in post-9/11 America. At the same time, it tries to distinguish between peaceful Muslims like Mahmoud initially appears to be and actual terrorists. The episode attempts to show how ordinary people can get caught up in extremist movements without fully understanding what they're joining. Peter's conversion to Islam starts innocently through friendship and cultural curiosity, but he ends up involved in a murder plot because he's naive and doesn't ask the right questions about his new friend's activities. The racial dynamics are particularly uncomfortable because the episode both mocks anti-Muslim prejudice and reinforces it. Brian criticizes his friends for their racism and points out that every ethnic group has extremists, but the Muslim characters are still mostly shown as either violent terrorists or oppressed women. The episode wants credit for being tolerant while still playing into harmful stereotypes. The terrorism plot itself is treated surprisingly seriously for Family Guy. While there are jokes throughout, the actual bomb threat and Peter's danger feel real and scary. The episode doesn't make light of the potential casualties or treat terrorism as purely comedic material. This creates a strange tone where serious subject matter gets mixed with the show's usual crude humor. Peter's speech defending America while being held at gunpoint shows the episode trying to be patriotic and critical at the same time. He lists both America's problems and its freedoms, suggesting that despite its flaws, the country doesn't deserve to be attacked by terrorists. This reflects the complex feelings many Americans had about their country during the War on Terror era. The ending, where Joe mentions that innocent Arabs are now under suspicion because of the arrests, shows how anti-terrorism efforts often hurt innocent people. This was a real issue during the post-9/11 period, when many Muslim Americans faced discrimination and surveillance because of their religion or ethnicity. Turban Cowboy represents Family Guy at its most ambitious and problematic. The episode tackles serious issues about terrorism, religious freedom, and racial prejudice, but it does so through humor that often reinforces the very stereotypes it claims to criticize. It wants to be both edgy and socially conscious, but the result is an episode that trivializes real issues while pretending to address them thoughtfully. After Turban Cowboy pushed limits with terrorism and racism, Da Boom went even darker, putting the Griffins in a nuclear apocalypse with radiation, cannibals, and society falling apart. Da Boom shows the Griffin family surviving a nuclear holocaust caused by Y2K computer failures and dealing with the deadly effects of radiation poisoning in a post-apocalyptic world. This episode explores how quickly civilization can collapse and how radiation turns people into horrible mutants. The episode takes place during the Y2K scare at the end of 1999. Everyone's freaking out that computer systems will crash when the year 2000 hits, causing planes to drop out of the sky and nuclear weapons to go off by themselves. Peter gets totally convinced the world's ending at midnight on New Year's Eve after some guy in a chicken suit tells him about it. Like, who takes advice from a chicken mascot? But that's Peter for you. While everyone else wants to party at Quagmire's place for New Year's, Peter drags his whole family into this basement shelter he built. He makes them all wear these ridiculous radiation suits and hoards a bunch of nasty, dehydrated food. Lois thinks he's lost his mind and keeps trying to get them to leave for the party, but Peter won't budge. He's convinced they'll all die if they step outside. So, the whole family gets stuck in this cramped basement, missing what should be the party of the millennium. Then, midnight hits and holy crap, Peter was actually right. Nuclear missiles start launching everywhere and massive explosions just wipe out everything. The family watches through this tiny window as their entire neighborhood gets turned into a burning wasteland. It's like watching the end of the world in real time. All those people at Quagmire's party, dead. Everyone who thought Peter was crazy, also dead. Turns out the paranoid fat guy was the only one who saw it coming. When they finally crawl out of their shelter, the world's completely screwed. Their house is gone, the neighborhood looks like hell, and there's radiation everywhere making everyone sick. This is where things get really messed up. Cleveland and Quagmire somehow got fused together into this weird two-headed monster sharing one body. They're still the same guys personality-wise, but now they're stuck together, forever arguing about everything. It's funny, but also really disturbing when you think about it. The radiation keeps getting worse and doing horrible things to people. Stewie turns into this gross octopus thing with tentacles instead of arms and legs. The kid's just a baby, and he doesn't understand why his body's falling apart. Lois tries to act like everything's normal, making him little outfits for his tentacles, but you can see she's terrified. Other survivors have gone completely nuts and started eating people. Like, they're literally cooking and eating other humans just to stay alive. The family becomes homeless and has to wander around looking for food and shelter. Most of the other survivors they meet have turned into violent cannibals or crazy mutants. They find this one peaceful farming community that seems nice at first, but then they have to deal with Randy Newman sitting there all day singing about every stupid thing he sees. It's like torture. The guy just won't shut up, describing every little detail in song form until everyone wants to scream. Peter decides to lead the family to this Twinkie factory in Natick because he heard somewhere that Twinkies can survive nuclear wars. They actually find the place still standing, with tons of food inside. So they decide to build a new civilization there called New Quahog. But even in their new town, the radiation effects keep getting worse. People are still mutated freaks, and the psychological damage from surviving nuclear war makes everyone paranoid and crazy. This is where Peter really shows what a terrible leader he is. He becomes like a dictator in New Quahog, making incredibly stupid decisions that put everyone in danger. The worst part is when he destroys their entire water supply just so he can build guns. Like, they need water to live, but Peter's so obsessed with having weapons that he ruins their irrigation system. When people try to tell him he's being an idiot, he just ignores them and keeps making things worse. The other survivors eventually get so fed up with Peter's terrible leadership that they kick him and his whole family out of town. So now they're homeless again, wandering around a radioactive wasteland with nowhere to go. It's actually pretty sad because all Peter wanted was to protect his family, but his paranoia and stupidity ended up making their lives worse. The guy who saved them from the apocalypse also becomes the reason they can't find peace anywhere. What's really dark about this episode is how it shows radiation poisoning destroying both people's bodies and their minds. The mutations represent how the nuclear war stripped away everything human about these people. Cleveland and Quagmire are still friends, but being fused together drives them crazy. Stewie's still a baby, but his octopus body makes him feel like a monster. The radiation changes who you are as a person. The show treats all this horror as comedy, but there's real fear underneath the jokes. When Stewie looks at his tentacles and calls himself repugnant, it's funny because he's using big words, but it's also heartbreaking because he's just a kid who doesn't understand what happened to him. The episode manages to be hilarious and terrifying at the same time, which is pretty impressive for a cartoon. The cannibalism stuff is particularly nasty. Seeing news anchors casually eating Asian reporter Trisha Takanawa like she's barbecue shows how quickly civilized people can become animals when they're desperate. These were probably normal folks before the bombs dropped, but starvation and radiation turned them into monsters who see other humans as food. It's disturbing because it suggests that civilization is just a thin layer over our basic survival instincts. The ending where it turns out to be a dream from Dallas is kind of a cop-out, but by then you've already spent 20 minutes watching this family suffer through hell. Even if none of it really happened, the images of nuclear destruction and human mutation stick with you. The episode taps into real Cold War fears that were still pretty fresh in people's minds, even in 1999. Da Boom stands out because it shows the complete breakdown of everything the characters care about. Their home gets vaporized, their bodies get mutated, their community falls apart, and their humanity gets stripped away piece by piece. The radiation turns them into things that aren't really people anymore. It's one of the few Family Guy episodes that actually makes you think about serious stuff while you're laughing at the jokes. The episode asks what would really happen if the world ended, and the answer is pretty depressing. People wouldn't band together and rebuild civilization in some noble way. They'd become selfish, violent, and crazy. They'd eat each other, fight over scraps, and follow terrible leaders who make everything worse. The nuclear holocaust reveals that underneath our polite society, we're all just scared animals trying to survive, and that's a pretty dark message for a comedy show. After surviving the end of the world in Da Boom, Peter now faces death and the collapse of his own life in Death Lives. Death Lives shows Peter having a near-death experience where he meets death himself and learns that his wife Lois is going to divorce him in the future. The episode deals with existential horror through death as a real character who controls when people die and forces Peter to confront his own mortality and failed marriage. The episode starts with Peter ditching his wedding anniversary to play golf with his friends. He lies to Lois and sets up a fake scavenger hunt to keep her busy while he goes to an expensive country club. Peter's being a total selfish jerk, but he thinks he's being clever by fooling his wife. Meanwhile, Lois is actually enjoying the scavenger hunt because she thinks Peter put effort into planning something romantic for their anniversary. While playing golf in a thunderstorm, Peter gets struck by lightning and has a near-death experience. This is where the episode gets really dark and weird. Instead of just passing out or going to a hospital, Peter's soul gets pulled out of his body and he meets death face to face. But death isn't some scary skeleton with a hood. He's this regular-looking guy who's kind of pathetic and lives with his nagging mother. Death tells Peter that he's not actually dying, just having a near-death experience. Then he drops this bomb on Peter. Lois is going to divorce him, and he'll die 2 years after that happens. Peter freaks out because he can't believe Lois would ever leave him. Death decides to show Peter the past to prove his point, taking him back in time to see how their relationship really started. The flashback stuff is where the existential horror really kicks in. Death has the power to travel through time and show Peter moments from his life that he's forgotten or ignored. They watch Peter and Lois's first meeting, their early romance, and Peter meeting Lois's rich father. The creepy part is that death can just pull up any moment from Peter's life like he's watching a movie. It makes you realize that someone is always watching and recording everything you do. When they see Peter's past, it becomes clear how much he's changed. Young Peter was willing to turn down $1 million from Lois's father just to be with her. He was romantic, attentive, and actually cared about making Lois happy. Current Peter can't even be bothered to spend his anniversary with his wife. He's become this lazy, selfish guy who takes Lois for granted and lies to her constantly. Death keeps trying to get Peter to have a revelation that will save his marriage, but Peter's too stupid to figure it out. He keeps guessing wrong things like God loves a working man, while Death gets more and more frustrated. The whole time, Death is complaining about his own problems, especially his overbearing mother who treats him like a child, even though he's literally the force that ends all life. The mother stuff adds another layer of existential horror. Here's Death, the most powerful force in the universe, and he's still getting nagged by his mom about zipping up his fly and eating his vegetables. It suggests that even cosmic forces are trapped in these petty, human relationships. Death can control who lives and dies, but he can't escape his mother's criticism. While Peter's having his spiritual crisis with death, Lois discovers that he lied about the scavenger hunt and is actually playing golf. She's heartbroken and furious because she thought Peter had finally made an effort for their anniversary. The betrayal hits her hard because she realizes Peter will always choose his own fun over spending time with her. Death finally gets fed up with Peter's stupidity and threatens to leave him in limbo forever. But then Peter offers to help Death get a girlfriend, since Death is lonely and can't seem to meet women. This leads to this bizarre subplot, where Peter becomes Death's wingman, trying to help the Grim Reaper pick up chicks at the beach and coffee shops. The whole dating sequence is surreal and darkly funny. Death is terrible with women because he's awkward and still lives with his mom. He keeps striking out with girls who find him weird and creepy. Peter tries to give him advice, but it's hard to make Death seem appealing when he literally represents everyone's worst fear. Eventually, Death does meet a girl named Amy who works at a pet store. Peter encourages him to be honest and direct, and surprisingly, it works. Amy agrees to go on a date with Death, which makes him happy and grateful to Peter. This is when Peter finally has his revelation. He needs to pay more attention to his wife and stop taking her for granted. Death sends Peter back to his body just as Lois arrives at the golf course, angry about being lied to. But Peter surprises her by having arranged for Peter Frampton to play their wedding song as an anniversary gift. Lois is moved by the gesture and forgives Peter, suggesting that maybe their marriage can be saved after all. What makes this episode really dark is how it treats death and time as these casual, controllable things. Death can just yank Peter's soul out of his body whenever he wants and show him any moment from his past or future. There's no privacy, no escape from being judged and evaluated. The episode suggests that someone is always watching and keeping score of your life. The existential horror comes from realizing that your whole life is just entertainment for cosmic forces. Death treats Peter's marriage problems like a TV show he's watching, getting frustrated when Peter doesn't learn his lesson fast enough. It makes human relationships seem insignificant when they're being judged by immortal beings who have seen it all before. The episode also shows how people can become completely different from who they used to be without even realizing it. Peter genuinely doesn't understand how much he's changed since he first met Lois. He thinks he's still the same romantic guy who gave up $1 million for love, but really he's become this selfish jerk who can't even spend one day focusing on his wife. Death himself is a pretty depressing character. He's got all this cosmic power, but he's still lonely, awkward, and dominated by his mother. It suggests that even the most powerful forces in the universe are trapped by the same petty problems that plague regular people. Death might control life and death, but he can't control his own happiness or relationships. The ending where Peter saves his marriage feels kind of fake because we know he hasn't really learned anything permanent. Death already told him that Lois will eventually divorce him, so this anniversary gesture is just delaying the inevitable. The episode leaves you with this sense that some futures can't be changed, no matter how hard you try. Death Lives is dark because it treats mortality and cosmic judgment as real things that regular people have to deal with. Peter gets confronted with his own death timeline and has to face the fact that his marriage is doomed. Even when he seems to fix things, there's this underlying sense that fate has already been decided, and he's just going through the motions until everything falls apart. After almost dying and nearly losing his marriage in Death Lives, Peter dives into fame and trouble in Patriot Games, letting his ego cause chaos. Patriot Games. Patriot Games shows Peter Griffin joining the New England Patriots football team after impressing Tom Brady with his athletic ability. But the episode deals more with Peter's ego problems and gambling debts than extreme sports violence and brain damage. While there is football violence, it's not the main focus you described. The episode starts with Peter losing a $50 bet to Stewie on a celebrity boxing match between Carol Channing and Mike Tyson. This sets up a subplot where Stewie becomes a violent loan shark trying to collect the money from Peter. Meanwhile, Peter doesn't want to go to his high school reunion because he feels like a loser compared to his successful classmates. At the reunion, Peter lies and claims he's a secret agent astronaut millionaire to impress people. When his classmates discover he's lying, Peter gets drunk and ends up throwing up. But his vomiting display somehow impresses Tom Brady, who happens to be at the reunion, and Brady invites Peter to try out for the New England Patriots. Peter makes the team and becomes obsessed with being a celebrity athlete. He starts doing car dealership commercials, buying expensive stuff like a $30,000 wax sculpture, and acting like a big shot. The success completely goes to his head, and he becomes arrogant and showboaty during games. The football violence in the episode is pretty standard stuff. Peter gets tackled and hits other players, but there's no focus on brain damage or serious injuries from the sport. The show treats the football action as normal game violence rather than exploring the darker health consequences of playing professional football. Peter's attitude problems get worse as his fame grows. He starts showboating on the field, doing elaborate touchdown dances, and ignoring his coach's orders. During one game, he performs an entire musical number from The Music Man after scoring, complete with choreographed dancing. His teammates and coaches get fed up with his behavior. The Patriots eventually fire Peter for being too much of a prima donna. They trade him to the worst football team in Europe, the London Silly Nannies. Peter's family has to move to England, where they struggle to adjust to British culture and lifestyle. The London team is portrayed as completely pathetic. The players are wimpy British stereotypes who have tea parties instead of practicing hard. They're more interested in being polite and proper than playing aggressive football. Peter tries to toughen them up by giving them steroids and making them train harder. Peter challenges the New England Patriots to a grudge match to prove himself. The build-up to this game creates tension, but when the actual game happens, it's a complete massacre. The Patriots absolutely destroy the London team, crushing them with superior size, speed, and skill. The ending shows Peter getting completely demolished by the entire Patriots team. He gets tackled and beaten up pretty badly, but even then the show doesn't focus on brain damage or long-term health effects. Peter just gets roughed up and then gets respect from Tom Brady for having the courage to stand up to the whole team by himself. Meanwhile, the Stewie loan shark subplot gets increasingly violent throughout the episode. Stewie beats up Peter multiple times, shoots Brian in both knees, and sets him on fire when Brian can't pay his gambling debt. This violence is much more extreme and graphic than anything that happens during the football games. What makes the episode dark is how it shows Peter's character flaws destroying his opportunities. He had a chance to be a professional athlete, but his ego and need for attention ruined everything. Peter can't handle success without becoming an arrogant jerk who alienates everyone around him. The episode also shows how gambling can lead to serious problems. Peter's $50 bet seems harmless at first, but it spirals into Stewie becoming a violent criminal who tortures people for money. The contrast between Peter's football fame and his hidden gambling debts creates tension throughout the story. The football violence itself is played mostly for laughs, rather than serious commentary about sports injuries. When Peter gets crushed by the Patriots at the end, he bounces back pretty quickly without any lasting damage. The show treats football hits as cartoon violence rather than realistic depictions of what happens to players' brains and bodies. The episode ends with Peter earning Tom Brady's respect for his courage, suggesting that sometimes standing up for yourself matters more than winning. But there's no discussion of concussions, chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or other real health issues that affect football players. The cultural clash element becomes more prominent when the Griffin family moves to London. They struggle with British customs, food, and lifestyle differences. Lois tries to adapt by calling the toilet a loo and making jokes about British TV being boring. The kids have trouble adjusting to their new school and the different social expectations. The London Silly Nannies are portrayed as the complete opposite of tough American football players. They're effeminate, polite, and more interested in having pillow fights in pajamas than training hard for games. When Peter tries to make them more aggressive by giving them steroids, it doesn't work because their whole culture is based on being genteel and proper. Peter's desperation to prove himself leads him to make increasingly bad decisions. He challenges the Patriots to a game he knows his team can't win, just because his ego can't handle being seen as a failure. The whole situation becomes a metaphor for how pride can make people do stupid things that hurt themselves and others. The actual grudge match is brutal in its one-sidedness. The Patriots players are huge, fast, and experienced professionals, while the London team consists of small, weak players who don't really understand American football. It's less of a game and more like watching adults beat up children. When Peter stands alone against the entire Patriots team at the end, it's both heroic and pathetic. He's showing courage by not giving up, but he's also being incredibly stupid by taking on impossible odds. The scene works as both an inspiring moment and a commentary on how stubborn pride can lead to unnecessary suffering. The steroid subplot adds another dark element to the episode. Peter casually gives performance-enhancing drugs to amateur players who don't understand the health risks. This reflects real issues in sports, where pressure to win leads athletes to make dangerous choices about their bodies. The episode's treatment of celebrity culture is also pretty cynical. Peter's brief fame goes to his head instantly, and he becomes insufferable as soon as he gets attention. The commercial endorsements and expensive purchases show how quickly success can corrupt someone who wasn't prepared for it. Tom Brady's character serves as a contrast to Peter throughout the episode. Brady remains professional and focused on winning, while Peter becomes distracted by fame and personal glory. When Brady finally respects Peter at the end, it's not for his football skills, but for his willingness to take punishment without giving up. The violence in Patriot Games is more about personal consequences than systematic sports injuries. Peter gets hurt because of his own bad choices. The episode uses violence as punishment for character flaws, rather than examining the real health costs of professional athletics. Patriot Games is more about Peter's personality problems and the consequences of his gambling than it is about extreme sports, violence, or brain damage. While there is football violence, the episode doesn't explore the serious health risks of playing professional football or focus on the long-term damage that repeated hits can cause to players' brains and bodies. The show treats sports violence as cartoon entertainment rather than addressing the real medical issues that affect athletes. After Peter ruins his football chances in Patriot Games, he ends up lost at sea in Perfect Castaway, and his family has to live without him. Perfect Castaway. Perfect Castaway shows Peter getting lost at sea and presumed dead, leading his wife Lois to remarry his best friend Brian the dog. When Peter returns, months later, he discovers his family has moved on without him, and he has to fight to win back his wife from his former pet. The episode starts with Peter struggling as a fisherman, unable to catch enough fish to feed his family. He's desperate and considers himself a failure as a provider. An old sea captain tells him about Pelican's Reef, a legendary fishing spot where there are supposedly more fish than anyone could imagine. The catch is that no sailor has ever returned from there alive. Peter decides to risk everything and takes Joe and Quagmire on a fishing trip to this dangerous location. They're motivated by the promise of huge catches that could solve all of Peter's money problems. The trip starts well when they reach Pelican's Reef and find it's actually full of fish, just like the story said. But then Hurricane RuPaul hits while they're out at sea. Their boat gets destroyed and they're shipwrecked on a deserted island for months. Back in Quahog, the family holds a funeral for Peter, Joe, and Quagmire, believing they're all dead. Death himself appears in the episode to confirm that their ship was swallowed whole by the treacherous, unforgiving sea. While the guys are stuck on the island, some really dark stuff happens. Peter actually starts eating Joe's legs while Joe is unconscious, which is completely messed up. When Joe wakes up and discovers what Peter's been doing, he's horrified and angry, but they're all so desperate they don't know what else to do. Back home, Lois is devastated by Peter's death, but has to keep the family together. Brian steps up and becomes the man of the house, even getting a job selling cars to support everyone financially. The kids start doing better in school, and their lives actually improve without Peter around. This creates a really uncomfortable situation where everyone realizes they might be better off without the family patriarch. After months of grieving, Lois and Brian end up getting married. This is super weird, because Brian is the family dog, but the show treats it like a normal relationship. Brian has always had a crush on Lois, and now that Peter's gone, he finally gets his chance to be with her. The marriage seems to work well, with Brian being more responsible and caring than Peter ever was. Then Peter suddenly returns home alive, having been rescued from the island. He expects everything to go back to normal, but he's shocked to discover that Lois married Brian. The family is happy to see Peter alive, but they've also moved on and built new lives without him. Peter realizes he's no longer needed or wanted in his own house. This creates a really painful love triangle where Peter has to compete with Brian for his own wife. Peter tries everything to win Lois back, including walking around naked and making crude attempts at seduction. But Lois feels obligated to stay with Brian because he saved the family when Peter abandoned them. The situation gets worse when Peter and Lois start having an affair behind Brian's back. They can't resist each other despite Lois being married to Brian. This makes Peter feel guilty but also justified, since he believes Lois is rightfully his wife. The affair shows how messy and painful it is when someone returns from the dead and disrupts the new life everyone built. Brian eventually discovers the affair when he finds Peter and Lois together. He's heartbroken because he genuinely loves Lois and thought they had a real marriage. But Brian realizes that Lois will always love Peter more, and their marriage was just a temporary solution to a crisis. In a moment of selfless love, Brian decides to divorce Lois so she can be with Peter again. He tells Lois that he doesn't think she's the right woman for him, even though it's obviously a lie to spare her feelings. Brian sacrifices his own happiness so that Peter and Lois can be together. The episode ends with everything going back to normal, but there's a sense that relationships have been permanently damaged. Brian is clearly depressed and lonely, having given up the love of his life. Peter got his family back, but he also knows they were doing fine without him, and maybe even better. What makes this episode particularly dark is how it deals with the idea that families can move on from losing someone. Peter's death actually improved everyone's lives in many ways. Brian was a better husband and father figure, the kids were more successful, and the family was more stable. When Peter returns, he disrupts this better life they built. The episode also explores the uncomfortable reality of how quickly people can replace someone they've lost. Lois genuinely grieved for Peter, but she also fell in love with Brian and built a new life. When Peter returns, she has to choose between the husband she thought was dead and the new husband who saved her family. The cannibalism subplot, with Peter eating Joe's legs, adds another layer of horror to the survival story. It shows how quickly civilized people can become monsters when they're desperate. Peter literally consumes his friend to stay alive, which creates lasting trauma for both of them. Brian's sacrifice at the end is both noble and tragic. He gives up his happiness so Peter and Lois can be together, but he's clearly devastated by the loss. The episode ends with Brian alone and depressed, having tasted love and then given it up. His final scene where he goes to the basement to masturbate is both funny and deeply sad. Perfect Castaway is dark because it shows how death and abandonment can actually improve people's lives in some ways. Peter's family was better without him, which raises questions about his value as a husband and father. When he returns, he has to face the reality that he might not be as important to his family as he thought he was. After Peter's disappearance in Perfect Castaway shows his family can do better without him, Death Has a Shadow shows how one stupid choice can ruin everything he has. Don't forget to subscribe to us. Death Has a Shadow. Death Has a Shadow shows Peter Griffin getting fired from his job after a drunken night leads to dangerous toys being shipped to children, then committing welfare fraud that nearly destroys his family and lands him in prison. This first episode of Family Guy deals with how one bad decision can spiral into financial ruin and threaten to tear apart everything you care about. The episode starts with Peter promising Lois he won't drink at a bachelor party, but of course he gets completely wasted with his buddies Cleveland and Quagmire. They're watching porn and getting drunk, which seems harmless enough until Peter has to go to work the next day with a massive hangover. Peter works at a toy factory where his job is to watch for dangerous products that could hurt kids. Because Peter's still drunk and falling asleep on the job, he completely fails to notice when deadly weapons start going down the conveyor belt instead of safe toys. Knives, gasoline tanks, and other lethal stuff gets packaged up and shipped out to children across the country. When kids start getting hurt by these toys, Peter gets fired immediately and his family faces financial disaster. This is where things get really dark because Peter makes the worst possible choice to fix his money problems. Instead of looking for another job or cutting expenses, he decides to commit welfare fraud. He applies for government assistance and somehow gets approved for way more money than he should, receiving thousands of dollars per week instead of a normal welfare amount. At first, the family thinks they've won the lottery. Peter starts buying crazy, expensive stuff like renting the statue of David and getting a blimp. The kids love having money for once, and even Lois enjoys not worrying about bills. But the whole foundation of their new wealth is built on lies and illegal activity, which creates this constant tension about when it's all going to collapse. The welfare fraud storyline gets more and more ridiculous as Peter spends government money on increasingly stupid purchases. He's living like a millionaire on taxpayer money, which makes him look like a complete scumbag. The episode shows how easy it is to get addicted to money you don't deserve, and how quickly you can lose your moral compass when you're desperate. Lois starts getting suspicious about where all this money is coming from, and when she finds out Peter's been lying and stealing from the government, she's absolutely furious. She tells Peter she doesn't even know who he is anymore, and that the man she married would never think he could solve problems just by throwing money at them. Their marriage nearly falls apart because Peter chose crime over honesty. The whole scam comes crashing down when Peter decides to take his family to the Super Bowl in a blimp he bought with stolen welfare money. Because Peter's an idiot who can barely drive a car, he crashes the blimp right into the stadium during the game. This creates a massive public spectacle that exposes his fraud to the entire country on live television. Peter gets arrested and has to face a federal judge who sentences him to 24 months in prison for welfare fraud. The family is devastated because they're about to lose their father and husband, and they're also broke again because all the money gets taken away. Stewie saves the day with his mind control device, but the damage to the family's trust and stability has already been done. What makes this episode particularly harsh is how it shows that Peter's problems all stem from one night of drinking. If he had just kept his promise to Lois and stayed sober, he wouldn't have been hungover at work, wouldn't have let dangerous toys through, wouldn't have gotten fired, and wouldn't have turned to crime. One bad decision creates a domino effect that nearly destroys everything. The episode also shows how financial desperation can make people do terrible things. Peter knows welfare fraud is wrong, but he's so scared of not being able to provide for his family that he convinces himself it's justified. The show doesn't make Peter look sympathetic, though. He clearly enjoys spending money he didn't earn and acts like he deserves it. The welfare fraud plot hits different because it's a real crime that real people commit when they're desperate. Unlike most Family Guy episodes with crazy supernatural stuff, this one deals with a crime that actually ruins families and costs taxpayers money. Peter's literally stealing from other people. The relationship damage between Peter and Lois is the most serious part of the episode. Lois genuinely considers leaving Peter because she can't trust someone who would lie to her face and risk their family's future for easy money. When she says she doesn't know who Peter is anymore, it feels like a real marriage crisis. Even though Stewie fixes everything at the end with his mind control ray, the episode establishes that Peter is capable of making decisions that could destroy his family. He's someone who will choose his own immediate gratification over his family's long-term well-being. This sets up the pattern for the entire series, where Peter's selfishness constantly threatens his family. Death Has a Shadow is dark because it shows how quickly a normal middle-class family can fall into poverty and crime. Peter goes from being a regular working dad to being a federal criminal in just a few weeks. The episode demonstrates that financial stability is fragile and that one person's bad choices can drag down everyone who depends on them. The episode ends with Peter immediately starting to plan his next scam, showing that he didn't actually learn anything from almost going to prison. This suggests that the cycle of irresponsible behavior and family crisis is going to continue, which makes the whole situation feel hopeless rather than resolved. After Peter ruins his family with lies and theft, Herpe, the love sore, shows that even friends can betray you and leave lasting harm. Herpe, the love sore, shows Brian knowingly giving Stewie herpes through a blood brother ritual, then dealing with the mess as the STD spreads and ruins relationships. This episode shows how sexually transmitted diseases can wreck trust between friends and turn people into social outcasts. The episode starts with Stewie wanting to become blood brothers with Brian after watching some old cowboy movie. Stewie thinks mixing blood is this cool bonding thing that will make their friendship even tighter. Brian doesn't really want to do it, but goes along with cutting their hands and mixing their blood together. The problem is, Brian knows he has herpes and doesn't tell Stewie about it. The next morning, Stewie wakes up with this nasty herpes sore on his lip. He's totally grossed out and immediately goes after Brian for giving him the disease. Brian tries to act like herpes is no big deal, even saying they should call it Boppo to make it sound less scary. But Stewie is pissed because Brian knew he was infected and passed it on without any warning. The herpes outbreak becomes a total nightmare for Stewie. He has to make these embarrassing phone calls to everyone he's hooked up with, including apparently some cartoon character from a kids' show. When he tries to help with wedding invitations, the other people are disgusted by how he looks and treat him like he's contagious with the plague. Brian's herpes is so gross that when Stewie looks at his mouth, he says Brian is more herpes than dog. Brian has clearly been living with this infection for ages and spreading it to other people through his hookups. The episode shows what a selfish jerk Brian is for not telling his partners about his STD. The disease starts messing up Brian's dating life right away. When he's on a date with some woman at a restaurant, Stewie and Chris show up and loudly announce that Brian has herpes. The woman gets disgusted and leaves, ruining Brian's chance with someone whose dad has money. This shows how herpes can kill romantic opportunities and make people avoid you like you're toxic. There's also this side story where Peter gets embarrassed at their regular bar booth by some tough guys, which makes everyone lose respect for him. His own family starts treating him like garbage because word spreads that he's a wimp. This other storyline shows how fast your social status can collapse when people see you as weak or pathetic. The herpes keeps spreading through the episode. Chris tells everyone that he also got herpes from Brian when they became blood brothers in some other incident. So Brian has now infected multiple family members with his STD and didn't warn any of them first. This makes Brian look like a total scumbag who puts the people closest to him in danger. Stewie and Chris team up to get back at Brian for infecting them. They hack his Facebook and embarrass him online, making sure everyone knows he has herpes. They also mess with his social life by following him around and telling strangers about his STD. This public shaming makes Brian's life hell. The episode shows how herpes affects people's feelings about themselves and their mental health. Stewie becomes lonely and depressed, even talking to his teddy bear about being infected. The physical stuff is gross and painful, but the social shame is what really destroys people's lives. Having herpes makes them feel dirty and like nobody wants them. Brian finally admits he was too embarrassed to tell people about his herpes. He says he was ashamed of having an STD and hoped he could hide it from friends and family. But lying about it made everything worse because now people can't trust him about anything important. The episode shows how STDs can wreck relationships even between best friends. Stewie says he realized for the first time that he couldn't trust his closest friend. When someone lies about their STD status, it breaks the basic trust that all relationships need. Even after Brian says sorry, their friendship is permanently messed up. The ending reveals that herpes flares up when people are stressed, meaning infected people will have visible symptoms during big life events like job interviews and weddings. This creates this cycle where the disease keeps interfering with important opportunities and milestones, making it impossible to escape what it does to your life. The episode also shows how the stigma around STDs can be just as bad as the actual disease. People treat Stewie like he's contaminated and dangerous just because he has a sore on his lip. The social rejection and isolation can be worse than the physical symptoms, especially for someone young like Stewie, who doesn't understand why everyone's avoiding him. Brian's behavior throughout the episode shows how some people deal with having STDs by being reckless and selfish. Instead of being responsible and telling partners about his condition, he spreads it around and acts like it's no big deal. This kind of attitude is what keeps STDs spreading and hurting innocent people who trusted the wrong person. The blood brother ritual itself becomes this twisted symbol of how diseases spread through intimate contact. What should have been a moment of friendship and bonding becomes the source of lifelong infection and broken trust. It shows how one moment of poor judgment can have consequences that last forever. The episode doesn't offer any real solution or hope for the characters who got infected. Unlike most Family Guy episodes where problems get fixed by the end, herpes is permanent and keeps affecting the characters forever. This makes the episode darker because there's no way to undo the damage that Brian caused. The parallel storyline with Peter getting humiliated at the bar shows how quickly someone can go from respected to outcast in their social group. Both Peter and the herpes victims learn that their social status was more fragile than they thought. Once people see you as weak, pathetic, or diseased, they treat you totally different. What makes this episode really dark is how it deals with the real consequences of STD transmission without sugarcoating anything. The herpes have to live with the physical symptoms, the social stigma, and the broken relationships for the rest of their lives. The episode also touches on how STDs disproportionately affect people's sex lives and romantic relationships. Brian's dating prospects get ruined because women don't want to risk getting infected. This creates this cycle where people with STDs become more isolated and desperate, sometimes leading them to make even worse choices about disclosure. Herpe, the love sore, stands out as one of Family Guy's darkest episodes because it shows how diseases can destroy trust, relationships, and social standing in ways that never fully heal. The episode treats herpes as what it really is, a lifelong condition that affects both physical health and social relationships, with no easy fixes or happy endings. After showing how Brian's selfish choices with herpes hurt everyone, Brian and Stewie goes darker, showing Brian's depression and how much he depends on Stewie to keep living. Brian, Stewie. You know how sometimes you get stuck in an elevator with someone and end up having the weirdest conversation of your life? Well, Brian and Stewie is basically that, except one person is suicidal and the other one makes him eat poop. This episode locks Brian and Stewie in a bank vault all weekend, and what happens is way more messed up than you'd expect from a cartoon. So, they go to the bank because Brian needs to check his safety deposit box and Stewie wants to return some ridiculously expensive sweater. They're arguing about money when the vault door closes and traps them inside until Monday. Seems like no big deal at first, just wait it out, right? Wrong. Stewie immediately craps his diaper, and everything goes downhill from there. Here's where it gets gross. Stewie demands Brian change him, but there are no clean diapers. So Stewie comes up with this sick plan where Brian has to eat his poop, lick the diaper clean, and then lick his butt to get everything spotless. Brian is obviously disgusted, but Stewie keeps pushing and manipulating him until he actually does it. The whole poop eating scene is beyond disturbing. You don't see it happen directly, but you hear Brian gagging and throwing up. Then, because he's a dog, Brian ends up eating his own vomit too. It's absolutely revolting and shows how broken Brian really is. He literally ate baby poop because he couldn't handle being trapped with the smell. That's rock bottom right there. After this traumatic experience, they find a bottle of expensive scotch in Brian's box and start drinking. That's when the real bombshell drops. Stewie asks why Brian has a gun in his safety deposit box, and Brian tells him the truth. He keeps it there because he wants to kill himself. Brian isn't joking around or being dramatic. He's genuinely suicidal and has been planning his own death. The scotch they're drinking was supposed to be his last drink before he shot himself. He explains that just knowing he has a way out helps him get through each day, but sometimes everything feels like too much to handle. This is crazy because Brian is supposed to be the smart one on the show. He's the character who calls out everyone else's stupidity and acts all superior. But underneath all that, he's completely depressed and sees no point in living. He talks about how dogs should naturally live with purpose, but he wasn't born that way. He's tried to find meaning, but just can't. Stewie gets really upset hearing this. He tells Brian that he'd be lost without him, that Brian is his only real friend and the only person who makes life worth living. Stewie actually says he loves Brian, not in a weird way, but as the one person he truly cares about. This seems to help Brian realize that maybe having someone who needs him is enough reason to keep going. What makes this episode so dark is how real Brian's depression feels. There are no jokes about suicide or mental illness. His pain is genuine, and the show doesn't try to fix it with some easy solution. Having Stewie care about him helps, but it doesn't magically cure his depression. It just gives him one reason to postpone killing himself. The poop eating part is disturbing because it shows how desperate Brian is. He's already so beaten down by life that eating feces seems like just another thing he has to endure. Stewie manipulates him by threatening him and appealing to his desperation. The whole thing is degrading and pathetic, but the show presents it seriously rather than as a gross-out gag. This episode changed everything about how you see Brian. Every time he acts smart or gives advice in future episodes, you remember that he's secretly planning to kill himself. The knowledge that he keeps a gun specifically for suicide makes everything he does feel darker and more complicated. The conversation about living in the present is also pretty heavy. Brian admits he's never truly in the moment, always worried about the past or future. Stewie says the only time he feels present is watching kids' shows, which is both funny and sad because it shows how simple happiness can be if you let it. They end up reading together and falling asleep in the vault, which is actually touching after all the horrible stuff that happened. Brian reads from a first edition book while Stewie gets comfortable next to him. It shows these characters genuinely caring for each other in a way the show rarely allows. The episode proves that Family Guy can do serious drama when it wants to. By removing all the cutaway gags and random jokes, they created something that feels more like a play than a cartoon. It forces you to confront real issues like depression and psychological manipulation in a show you usually watch for laughs. What's really disturbing is the power dynamic between Brian and Stewie. Stewie gets Brian to do something absolutely degrading by using threats and manipulation. Brian goes along with it because he's already so broken that this seems normal. The fact that Stewie later admits he loves Brian makes the manipulation even more twisted. The episode raises uncomfortable questions about friendship and mental health. Is it healthy for Brian to depend on Stewie's need for him as his only reason to live? Is Stewie actually helping Brian, or just giving him something to focus on besides suicide? These are complex issues without easy answers. The long-term impact was huge because it showed that underneath all the comedy, these characters are actually pretty damaged. Brian is suicidal, Stewie is manipulative, and their friendship is built on mutual desperation. That's a lot darker than most people expected from a cartoon about a talking dog and baby. What makes Brian and Stewie so messed up is that it suggests some people are just fundamentally broken. Brian doesn't find new purpose or get cured of his depression. He just realizes that having one person who would be devastated by his death might be enough reason to postpone it. That's not exactly a happy ending, but it feels honest in a way most TV shows avoid. The episode basically says that sometimes the best you can hope for is finding someone who needs you enough to make life bearable. Brian's not going to get better, but maybe he won't kill himself as long as Stewie depends on him. It's a pretty grim view of friendship and mental health, but it's presented in a way that feels real and serious rather than exploitative. After showing how Brian and Stewie's messed up bond leads to terrible choices, Into Fat Air takes it further, making the Griffins eat a frozen teenager to survive. Into Fat Air. There's a certain kind of dark humor that comes from watching a cartoon family accidentally become cannibals, and Into Fat Air delivers exactly that. This episode takes the Griffins on a mountain climbing adventure that turns into a survival nightmare where they end up eating a dead teenager to avoid starving to death. The whole mess starts when Peter and Lois go to dinner at their old friends, the Fishmans' house. Ross Fishman is Lois's ex-boyfriend who's now super rich and successful, and he spends the entire dinner basically showing off and making the Griffins feel like losers. He talks about his fancy private school, his expensive vacations, and then drops the bomb that his family is planning to climb Mount Everest. Peter gets so jealous and embarrassed that he lies and says the Griffins are also climbing Everest. Ross clearly doesn't believe him and makes some comment about how the Griffin family doesn't look like they could handle such a challenge. This pisses off Lois so much that she decides they're actually going to do it, just to prove they're not second-class people. So, the Griffins pack up and head to Nepal to climb the world's most dangerous mountain, which is already a terrible idea. They have no experience, no proper training, and Peter brings completely useless supplies like a GPS that just keeps saying, "Go up." They're competing against the Fishmans to see who can reach the summit first, which turns this into a deadly race. The climb starts going wrong immediately. Peter falls into a crevice full of dead bodies. They run out of food because Peter brought a music playlist instead of trail mix, and then a massive blizzard traps them on the mountain. They're freezing, starving, and completely lost in whiteout conditions with no way to get help. That's when they find Ben Fishman, Ross's teenage son, frozen to death in the snow. The family is horrified at first and wants to bury him properly, but Brian points out the horrible truth. If they don't eat something soon, they're all going to die from exhaustion and hypothermia, just like Ben did. They literally have no other choice if they want to survive. The cannibalism scene is handled in typical Family Guy fashion. They don't show the actual eating, but they make it clear that the entire family consumed human flesh to stay alive. Stewie even makes a comment about being oddly prepared for cannibalism, which is disturbing on multiple levels. The show treats it as both tragic and darkly comedic at the same time. After eating Ben, they continue down the mountain and run into Ross and Pam Fishman, who are heading back up to look for their missing son. The Griffins have to pretend they haven't seen Ben while knowing they literally just ate him. Peter makes uncomfortable jokes about Ben squeezing himself out of a crevice soon, referring to when his remains will be digested. But then, Lois has a moment of conscience. She realizes they can't let the Fishmans go back up the mountain to die looking for their son. Even though these people have been condescending to them all episode, Lois says they have to do the right thing and rescue them. She says this is how the Griffins win and avoid being second best, by doing what's morally right. So they turn around and climb back up into the deadly storm to save Ross and Pam, who have fallen into a crevice and are about to freeze to death. Peter risks his own life to pull them both out, even though he's carrying extra weight and almost doesn't make it. The Fishmans are grateful and finally show the Griffins some respect. The episode ends with this twisted moment where Ross is thanking Peter for being such a good man and saving their lives. Peter starts to feel guilty and blurts out, "We ate your son," right as the credits roll. It's this horrible punchline that completely undermines the moral redemption they just earned. What makes this episode so dark is how it shows ordinary people can be pushed to do unthinkable things when survival is on the line. The Griffins aren't monsters, but they still committed cannibalism because the alternative was death. The show doesn't judge them for it, which makes it even more disturbing. The cannibalism also works as this twisted metaphor for how far people will go to prove they're not failures. The Griffins literally consumed another family's child just to avoid admitting they were second best. Their pride and jealousy led them to a situation where they had to do something horrific to survive. The rescue at the end is supposed to redeem them morally, but it also makes their earlier actions more complicated. They saved the fishmen's lives after eating their son. Are they heroes or monsters? The show doesn't give you an easy answer. This episode stands out because it takes a relatively normal family rivalry and pushes it to this extreme conclusion where people die and get eaten. Most sitcoms would never go there, but Family Guy uses the cannibalism to make a point about competitiveness, survival, and what people are really capable of when pushed to their limits. The fact that they specifically ate a teenager makes it worse because Ben was just an innocent kid caught up in his parents' adventure. His death wasn't even heroic or meaningful. He just froze to death and got eaten by strangers who were jealous of his family's success. Into Fat Heir basically argues that civilization is just a thin layer over our animal instincts. When the Griffins get hungry enough and desperate enough, they'll eat human flesh without much hesitation. The episode suggests that anyone could become a cannibal under the right circumstances, which is a pretty dark view of human nature. After showing the Griffins eating a dead kid to survive, Petarded goes darker by having Peter use his disability to hurt and control everyone around him. Petarded shows what happens when someone gets diagnosed with a mental disability and then uses that diagnosis to screw everyone over. Peter Griffin gets tested and finds out he's mentally disabled, but instead of being a victim, he becomes this manipulative jerk who ruins everything. So, this whole mess starts when Peter wins a game of Trivial Pursuit at game night with his friends. He's acting like he's some kind of genius because he answered questions like, "What color is a fire truck?" Problem is, Lois secretly switched his questions to the preschool edition so he wouldn't feel bad about himself. Peter has no clue and gets super cocky about being so smart. Peter starts bragging that he's genius material and could qualify for a MacArthur Genius Grant that pays $500,000. Lois gets fed up with his arrogance and basically dares him to take the actual test if he's such a genius. Peter agrees, thinking this will prove how brilliant he is once and for all. When Peter goes to take the IQ test, he's completely confident. The test itself is pretty basic stuff, but Peter struggles with even simple questions. When the results come back, he discovers he's not a genius at all. In fact, the test shows he's mentally disabled with an IQ just below the normal range. The doctor has to break it to him gently that he's mentally retarded, which was the terminology they used back then. At first, Peter freaks out completely. He calls his old high school girlfriend to warn her she might want to get tested too, thinking mental disability is contagious like an STD. He's embarrassed and worried about how people will treat him differently. The city immediately installs a wheelchair ramp at his house and puts up warning signs, which humiliates him in front of his neighbors. He's convinced his whole life is ruined and everyone will look down on him. But then Peter has this horrible realization that changes everything. He figures out he can use his disability status to get away with literally anything. When he crashes his car into news anchor Tom Tucker and seriously injures him, Tucker just shrugs it off once he finds out Peter is the retarded fellow. People suddenly excuse all his bad behavior as long as he mentions being disabled. Peter starts exploiting this everywhere he goes, and it gets really dark really fast. He disrupts church services by shouting, "Bible fight," and throws hymnals at people. When they get angry, he just says, "Sorry, I'm retarded," and they immediately back off saying, "Bless your heart." He destroys property at McDonald's by climbing into the fryer area and stealing equipment. Every time someone complains, he claims he doesn't know any better because of his condition. The exploitation gets way worse. Peter announces over the McDonald's intercom that testicles, that is all. And when people get upset, he just points to his head and shrugs. He steals a whole fryer machine from the restaurant, and nobody stops him because they feel sorry for him. He's basically figured out that society has this weird guilt thing where they won't hold disabled people accountable for anything. Meanwhile, his family is falling apart because of his behavior. The worst part is when Lois ends up in the hospital with severe burns from one of Peter's stunts. He was messing around with hot oil and ended up seriously injuring his wife, but he still doesn't take responsibility. Even when she's lying in a hospital bed looking like she got deep fried, Peter's more concerned with his own problems. Child Services eventually shows up and takes away his kids because they decide he's mentally unfit to be a parent. This is where you realize how far Peter's manipulation has gone. He's lost his children because he couldn't stop using his diagnosis as an excuse for terrible behavior. But even then, Peter doesn't learn his lesson. He tries to frame Cleveland as a bad parent by bringing prostitutes to Cleveland's house while Cleveland is babysitting Peter's kids. The whole scheme with the prostitutes shows just how calculated Peter's become. He's actively plotting to hurt people who are trying to help him. Cleveland was doing him a favor by watching his kids, and Peter repays him by trying to get him in trouble with Child Services. The court scene is where everything comes to a head. Peter tries to get his kids back by arguing that being mentally disabled doesn't automatically make someone a bad parent. He makes this emotional speech about how there are plenty of bad parents out there who aren't disabled but still get to keep their kids. For a moment, it seems like he might actually have learned something about discrimination and unfairness. But the judge sees right through Peter's manipulation. He calls Peter a monster and refuses to give him custody of his children. The judge is so disgusted by Peter's behavior that he wishes he could lock him up somewhere with other dangerous people, but admits he can't think of such a place. When someone points out he's describing prison, the judge realizes his mistake, but it's too late. He already banged the gavel. What makes this episode really dark is how it shows someone taking a real issue like disability discrimination and turning it into a weapon. Peter faces some genuine prejudice at first, like the city treating him differently just because of his test results. But instead of fighting that discrimination or trying to educate people, he decides to exploit it for personal gain. The episode also shows how Peter's exploitation hurts everyone around him, especially his family. His wife ends up hospitalized, his kids get taken away, and his friends lose respect for him. But Peter doesn't seem to understand that his behavior is the problem. He thinks he's just being clever by using his diagnosis to avoid consequences. He's become this sociopath who uses disability as a shield. The really messed up part is that Peter's exploitation makes things worse for people who actually have disabilities. By using his diagnosis as an excuse for terrible behavior, he reinforces all the worst stereotypes about disabled people being dangerous, unpredictable, or unable to control themselves. He takes what should be a call for understanding and turns it into a reason for people to be suspicious and afraid. The episode also shows how society doesn't know how to handle disability properly. People either treat Peter like he's completely helpless, or they let him get away with anything because they feel guilty. There's no middle ground where they see him as a person who happens to have a disability. Everyone's either condescending or completely permissive, which creates this perfect environment for Peter to manipulate. The episode ends with Peter getting his family back, but only because Lois recovers from her injuries and vouches for him. He doesn't really learn from his mistakes or face any real consequences for manipulating people. The system basically fails everyone. It fails to protect Peter's family from his behavior, it fails to hold him accountable, and it fails to provide any actual support for his disability. This episode is controversial because it tackles the sensitive topic of mental disability through Peter's selfish lens. It shows how someone can take a legitimate social issue and completely twist it for personal benefit, ultimately making things harder for people who genuinely need support and understanding. Peter becomes this cautionary tale about how disability accommodations can be abused by people with bad intentions. After Peter uses his disability to get away with hurting people, Boys Do Cry shows the Griffins facing real danger from hate and religious extremism. Boys Do Cry. This episode tackles religious extremism and hate crimes in ways that are way darker than most Family Guy stuff. Boys Do Cry shows what happens when the Griffin family gets chased out of their hometown by religious fanatics and ends up facing even worse bigotry in Texas. The whole nightmare starts when Lois becomes the church organist and forces everyone to go to Sunday service. During communion, Stewie throws up the communion wafer because he's just a baby who got sick. But the congregation immediately loses their minds and decides this means Stewie is possessed by Satan. We're talking about grown adults looking at a 1-year-old who threw up and concluding he must be filled with demons. Church officials literally show up at the Griffin house with plans to perform an exorcism on Stewie. They're not asking permission, they're demanding to take custody of the baby so they can drive out the evil spirits. These people are so caught up in their religious hysteria that they want to traumatize a toddler over something completely normal, like getting sick. So, the family has to flee Rhode Island and go into hiding. They end up staying at Lois's sister Carol's place in Texas, thinking they'll find safety and tolerance there. Lois is convinced that Texas will be this wholesome place with good family values where they can start over. She couldn't be more wrong about what they're walking into. Right away, you can tell Texas is going to be a problem. Peter goes to buy alcohol and automatically gets a free gun because that's apparently state law. Their neighbors introduce themselves, and the husband casually mentions that he's a queer chaser and beater, like that's a normal job description. The local news is obsessed with conservative politics and treats gay people like they're dangerous criminals. The homophobia gets really ugly when Stewie enters a Little Miss Texas beauty pageant disguised as a girl named Stephanie Griffin. He's just having fun performing his comedy routine, and the audience loves him. He actually wins the whole contest because his jokes are genuinely funny and the crowd is eating it up. But then someone realizes that Stephanie is actually a boy in a dress, and everything changes instantly. The same people who were applauding him seconds earlier start screaming, "It's one of them queerosexuals." They form an angry mob and chase the family out of the building, clearly planning to hurt them. The hatred is so intense and immediate that it's genuinely scary. What makes this scene so disturbing is how quickly the crowd turns violent. These aren't hardened criminals or extremists, they're regular families at a beauty pageant. But the moment they think they've encountered something that challenges their ideas about gender, they're ready to commit violence. It shows how thin the line is between acceptance and hatred. The episode also shows other kinds of bigotry that are just as dangerous. Peter almost gets lynched by a group of cowboys just for mentioning that he's mentally disabled. They literally say, "In Texas, we execute the retarded and start preparing to hang him." He only gets saved because a talking horse shows up to rescue him, which is absurd but doesn't make the threat any less real. Chris and Meg get recruited into a local youth club that worships George W. Bush like he's some kind of god. The kids have to steal Bush's underwear as an initiation ritual so they can bask in its bushy goodness. It's this creepy cult-like behavior where political figures get treated like religious icons. Meanwhile, Stewie is being forced to compete in toddler beauty pageants, which is its own kind of messed up. You have adults sexualizing little kids and judging them based on appearance and performance. The whole pageant culture is presented as this toxic environment that damages children for the entertainment of adults. What's really dark about this episode is that it shows how extremism exists everywhere, just targeting different groups. In Rhode Island, religious fanatics wanted to exorcise a baby over something completely innocent. In Texas, people want to beat up anyone who doesn't conform to their strict ideas about gender, sexuality, or ability. There's no safe place because hatred and ignorance follow you wherever you go. The family thinks they're escaping persecution by leaving their hometown, but they just end up facing different kinds of persecution. It's like jumping from one form of hell into another. The people who wanted to harm Stewie for being possessed are just as dangerous as the people who want to harm him for wearing a dress. The episode also shows how these attitudes affect real families. The Griffins have to live in constant fear, always looking over their shoulders and ready to run at any moment. The kids can't make real friends because they're always hiding who they really are. The stress of living under threat tears at the family's relationships and makes everyone paranoid. When the family finally returns home, Lois gives this speech about how real values come from within, not from where you live or who your neighbors are. But the damage has already been done in terms of showing how ugly people can become when they think their beliefs justify hurting others. The religious extremism angle is particularly disturbing because it shows adults willing to traumatize children in the name of faith. These church officials genuinely believe they're doing the right thing by wanting to exorcise a baby, which makes them even more dangerous than people who know they're being cruel. The homophobic violence is presented as this ever-present threat that can explode without warning. Stewie goes from being celebrated to being hunted in the span of seconds, just because people discovered something about his identity that they don't like. It demonstrates how fragile safety really is for people who are different. This episode was controversial because it directly criticized both liberal and conservative extremism while dealing with sensitive topics like homophobia, religious persecution, and disability discrimination. It showed that hatred exists across the political spectrum, just targeting different groups depending on the local culture. The really messed up part is that all of this violence and hatred is directed at a family with small children. Stewie is literally a baby, but people still want to hurt him because of their prejudices. It shows how extremism damages innocent people, especially kids who have no control over the situations they're born into. Boys Do Cry basically argues that tolerance and acceptance are rare, fragile things that can disappear instantly when people's fears and prejudices get triggered. The episode suggests that most places have the potential for violence and hatred just under the surface, waiting for the right excuse to come out. After showing how fear and prejudice put the Griffins in danger, Fresh Heir goes darker by showing how Peter exploits his own son for money. Fresh Heir. So there's this Family Guy episode called Fresh Heir that's basically about a father trying to marry his own son for money, and honestly, it's one of the most disturbing things the show ever did. We're talking about child manipulation and grooming disguised as comedy. The whole mess starts when Chris goes to take care of his injured grandfather Carter while he recovers from a broken leg. Chris has been feeling totally ignored by Peter, who never wants to spend time with him and keeps making excuses to avoid father-son activities. Peter literally tells Chris he was lying about going fishing just to make him go away. Chris and Carter end up having this amazing time together. Carter teaches Chris about masturbation, they have fun tracking pizza deliveries online, and they even start a band. Carter is genuinely impressed by Chris's innocence and good nature. When Carter tries to pay Chris for helping out, Chris refuses the money and says he just enjoyed spending time with his grandpa. This really touches Carter. Carter gets so moved by Chris's pure motives that he decides to rewrite his will and leave his entire fortune to Chris instead of Lois. He makes this big announcement at dinner, saying Chris deserves the money precisely because he doesn't want it. Carter thinks this makes Chris more worthy than the greedy adults in the family. Peter completely loses his mind when he hears this news. He's been counting on eventually inheriting Carter's wealth through Lois, and now it's all going to his teenage son. So Peter immediately starts scheming about how to get access to that inheritance money. First, Peter tries basic manipulation. He suddenly becomes Chris's best friend, buying him expensive gifts and pretending to share his interests. Peter learns Chris's ridiculously complicated handshake and starts dressing like what he thinks cool people wear. He takes Chris to fancy restaurants and acts like they're buddies. It's classic love-bombing behavior designed to gain the kid's trust. But Peter realizes simple manipulation might not be enough to guarantee long-term access to the money. So he comes up with this absolutely insane plan. He's going to marry Chris. Peter figures that as Chris's legal spouse, he'll have full access to the inheritance. This is where things get really creepy. Peter starts courting Chris like he's trying to seduce him. He takes him on what are basically romantic dates, shares intimate personal stories, and starts talking about their future together as a married couple. Chris doesn't understand what's happening because he's just a desperate kid, finally getting attention from his dad. Peter literally gets down on one knee and proposes to Chris with an engagement ring. He tells Chris that men marrying men is totally normal now, and that marriage means they'll get to spend all their time together doing fun activities. Chris agrees to marry his father because he's so starved for parental love that he'll take any form of attention. The wedding planning scenes are absolutely disturbing. Peter takes Chris to pick out china patterns and plan their honeymoon. They go to wedding venues and talk to caterers. Peter is treating this like a real romantic relationship, complete with discussing their sexual history and planning their first dance as a married couple. The actual wedding ceremony is where the episode reaches peak darkness. Peter has organized a full wedding in Vermont with guests, flowers, and a minister. He's written romantic vows comparing their relationship to Robert Frost poetry. The whole thing is played completely straight, which makes it even more unsettling. When Lois finally shows up to stop this madness, the most heartbreaking revelation comes out. Chris admits he knew all along that Peter was only marrying him for the money. But Chris says he doesn't care because planning the wedding was the most time Peter had ever spent with him. He's willing to let his father exploit him financially if it means getting the love and attention he's always craved. This hits Peter like a ton of bricks. He realizes how badly he's neglected Chris and how desperate his son has become for any kind of parental affection. Chris is so starved for his father's love that he'll accept being manipulated and used just to spend time with him. What makes this episode so disturbing is how accurately it shows the psychology of child exploitation. Peter uses all the classic grooming tactics, isolating the victim, showering them with gifts and special attention, making them feel chosen and special, and gradually escalating inappropriate behavior. The only difference is Peter's motive is money instead of sexual abuse. The episode also shows how children can normalize abusive behavior when it comes from people they're supposed to trust. Chris accepts Peter's increasingly bizarre behavior because he's desperate for any kind of relationship with his father. He'd rather be exploited than ignored completely. Chris revealing that he knew about Peter's motives all along is particularly dark because it shows how children often understand more than adults think they do. Chris isn't naive, he sees exactly what Peter is doing, but he's still willing to go along with it because the alternative is going back to being neglected. The wedding scene is especially uncomfortable because it shows how far Peter is willing to go for money. He's literally prepared to marry his own child and doesn't see anything fundamentally wrong with it as long as he gets the inheritance. The fact that it's technically legal in Vermont somehow makes it worse. Peter's manipulation gets so intense that he starts treating Chris like an actual romantic partner. He's jealous of Chris's time, possessive of his attention, and planning their life together as spouses. The power dynamic is completely messed up because Peter is the adult and the parent, but he's exploiting his position to manipulate a child. The episode ends with Peter realizing his mistake and choosing to be a real father instead of a predatory spouse. But the psychological damage has already been revealed. We see how desperate Chris was for attention and how far Peter was willing to go to exploit that desperation. This episode was controversial because it essentially depicted child grooming in animated form. Even though it's presented as comedy, the underlying themes of manipulation, exploitation, and inappropriate adult behavior toward children are genuinely disturbing. The show basically took real-world tactics used by predators and applied them to a father-son relationship for laughs. The episode suggests that emotional neglect can make children vulnerable to all kinds of abuse. Chris's willingness to accept exploitation just to get attention from his father shows how parental neglect creates dangerous vulnerabilities that can be exploited by anyone, even family members. What's really messed up is that the episode presents Peter's behavior as bumbling and misguided, rather than genuinely predatory. But if you look at his actions, objectively isolating a child, manipulating them with gifts and attention, gradually escalating inappropriate behavior, and ultimately trying to enter into a legal relationship that would give him control over the child's finances, it's textbook grooming behavior. The fact that Family Guy played this scenario for comedy while hitting all the beats of actual child exploitation makes it one of their darkest episodes ever. It shows how easily children can be manipulated by adults they trust, and how desperate kids will go along with almost anything if it means getting the love they need. After showing how Peter exploits his own son for love and money, Brian's A Bad Father takes it further by showing how a parent can abandon and manipulate a child purely for selfish gain. Brian's A Bad Father shows what happens when a deadbeat dad tries to use his abandoned son for personal gain. The whole mess starts when Brian gets a call from his son Dylan, who he's basically abandoned for years. Brian literally admits he decided to step away from the whole situation because he thought Dylan was better off without a father who's sometimes there, sometimes not. The problem is that Brian was never actually there to begin with, so his reasoning doesn't make any sense. When Dylan calls to say he's coming to town and wants to meet up, Brian immediately starts making excuses to avoid seeing him. He's about to blow off his own son until Stewie forces him to take the meeting. This shows how deeply Brian has rejected being a father. He genuinely thinks avoiding his kid is somehow the right thing to do. Brian hasn't seen Dylan in years and has no interest in building a relationship. He treats his son like an inconvenience rather than a person who might want to know his father. The whole setup shows how some parents just check out completely and then convince themselves they're doing everyone a favor. The really twisted part comes when Brian finds out Dylan is starring in a Disney Channel show. Suddenly, Brian's interested in his son again, but only because he sees an opportunity to advance his own failing writing career. Brian doesn't want to reconnect with Dylan as a father, he wants to use him as a networking contact. This is where you see how manipulative Brian can be. He starts talking about how the universe might want them to work together, making it sound like fate when really he just wants a job. Brian's basically treating his abandoned son like a business opportunity. Brian manipulates Dylan into getting him a job as a writer on the show by playing up this whole "wouldn't it be great to work together and reconnect" angle. Dylan, who's desperate for any relationship with his absent father, falls for it completely. The kid is so starved for parental attention that he's willing to risk his professional reputation just to spend time with Brian. You can see how much Dylan wants his father's approval. The kid lights up at the idea of working together because he thinks this might finally be his chance to have a real relationship with Brian. Dylan doesn't realize he's being used because he's too focused on getting the love he's always missed. Once Brian gets the job, his true colors come out immediately. He starts acting like some Hollywood hotshot, talking down to the other writers and pushing inappropriate content for a kids' show. He suggests storylines about suicide and other dark themes for a program aimed at 9-year-olds. Brian's so desperate to seem important and edgy that he completely loses sight of what's appropriate. The other writers hate Brian from day one because he's pretentious and unprofessional. He comes in acting like he knows everything about television writing when he's never worked on a show before. Brian treats everyone else like amateurs while contributing nothing useful himself. But Dylan keeps defending him because he's still hoping his dad will actually be a dad. The kid is basically protecting Brian from the consequences of his own terrible behavior. Dylan makes excuses for his father's unprofessionalism because he needs to believe Brian is worth having a relationship with. Brian's behavior at work is embarrassing. He throws around made-up terms like "stwistusion" and acts like the other writers are idiots for not knowing his fake industry jargon. He's trying so hard to seem like an expert that he comes across as a complete fraud. The workplace scenes show how Brian's narcissism makes him impossible to work with. He thinks his minimal life experience makes him more qualified than professional writers who actually understand their audience. Brian's so convinced of his own genius that he can't see how inappropriate his suggestions are. Things fall apart when Brian gets fired for being completely inappropriate and unprofessional. Instead of taking responsibility, he immediately runs to Dylan, expecting his son to fix the situation. Brian wants Dylan to use his influence as the star to get his father's job back, putting the kid in an impossible position. This is when Dylan finally sees what's really happening. Brian isn't interested in being a father, he just wanted to use his son's success to jumpstart his own career. The kid realizes he's been manipulated and that his father doesn't actually care about building a real relationship. Dylan finally calls Brian out, telling him, "You're a terrible father, I never want to see you again." The kid has reached his breaking point after years of abandonment followed by this latest betrayal. Dylan cuts off contact completely, leaving Brian alone with the consequences of his selfishness. What makes this episode so dark is how accurately it shows the psychology of deadbeat parents. Brian convinces himself that abandoning Dylan was somehow noble or protective, when really it was just about avoiding responsibility. He only shows interest when there's something in it for him, and even then he can't stop being selfish long enough to actually connect with his kid. Brian's justifications for being an absent father are typical of parents who abandon their kids. He tells himself he's protecting Dylan by staying away, but really he's just avoiding the hard work of being a parent. When he does show up, it's only when there's a clear benefit for himself. The episode also shows how parental abandonment affects children. Dylan is so desperate for his father's love that he's willing to overlook red flags and enable Brian's bad behavior. The kid risks his own career and reputation just to have some kind of relationship with his dad, which is genuinely heartbreaking. Dylan's reaction to his father's attention is painful to watch. He's so grateful for any crumb of interest from Brian that he doesn't see how he's being used. The kid has been abandoned for so long that he'll accept any kind of relationship, even a fake one. Brian's manipulation of Dylan is particularly cruel because he uses the kid's emotional vulnerability against him. Dylan wants a father so badly that he'll believe Brian's lies about wanting to reconnect. Brian exploits this desperation to get what he wants, then acts surprised when Dylan feels used. The episode shows how absent parents often show up when it's convenient for them, not when their kids need them. Brian had years to build a relationship with Dylan, but only gets interested when Dylan becomes famous. This kind of fair-weather parenting is incredibly damaging to children. When Brian gets fired, his first instinct is to use his son to fix the problem instead of accepting responsibility. He puts Dylan in the position of having to choose between his career and his relationship with his father. That's not something any kid should have to deal with, especially from a parent who's already abandoned them once. The episode ends with Brian realizing he's been a terrible father, but only after Dylan cuts him off completely. Brian's self-awareness comes too late to save the relationship, and Dylan is left dealing with the trauma of being abandoned by his father twice. What's really messed up is that Brian had multiple chances to do the right thing throughout the episode. He could have been honest about wanting to reconnect without ulterior motives. He could have behaved professionally at work. He could have taken responsibility when he got fired. But at every turn, Brian chose selfishness over his relationship with his son. The episode suggests that some damage can't be undone. Even though Brian eventually apologizes, Dylan has been hurt too many times to trust him again. The relationship might be permanently broken because Brian waited too long to actually be a father and then made everything worse when he finally showed up. This episode is dark because it shows how selfish adults can destroy their children's lives through neglect and manipulation. Brian actively makes things worse when he does get involved. The episode demonstrates that some people are too self-centered to ever be good parents, and their kids pay the price for that selfishness. The story also highlights how children of absent parents often blame themselves and will go to extreme lengths to win their parents' affection. Dylan risks everything just to have some kind of relationship with Brian, which shows how deeply parental abandonment affects kids' self-worth and decision-making. Brian's character represents a specific type of deadbeat parent, the one who shows up occasionally to use their kids for personal gain. These parents are often worse than ones who stay away completely because they give false hope and then crush it repeatedly. Dylan would probably be better off if Brian just stayed gone permanently. If you enjoyed today's video, subscribe to our channel for more Family Guy breakdowns.